at this time a cluster of events, and we are working every day to understand why these are taking place. I meet with the families of those who have been through this journey, and we are determined to make sure that in every situation we have done everything possible. Each one of these is a tragedy not only for the family and the individual, but for the military as an institution, and I can assure him we are spending every waking moment trying to deal with this current cluster and series of events in this area.
Lloyd Russell-Moore.
Number 10.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. No, Mr. Speaker, we don't intend to grant the rights that the question refers to. The Representation of the People Act sets out which non-UK nationals resident in the UK can vote in our parliamentary elections. This is restricted to citizens from Commonwealth countries, which includes Malta and Cyprus, and the Republic of Ireland, who meet residency requirements in the UK.
Lloyd Russell-Moore.
We currently give Commonwealth citizens who may have been here only 1 month and have no reciprocal rights for British citizens in Commonwealth countries the right to vote in this country. Why do we not give the right to vote for EU citizens that might have lived here for 20 years, paid tax throughout that time? Does the government not believe in representation and taxation?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's right, first of all, here actually to pay tribute to the contribution that EU citizens do and have made to our country and will continue to do in the future. And as my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, and other ministers have set out, we welcome those contributions. We are making the settlement scheme available the settled status scheme available in order to further that contribution to the life of our nation. But it is also the case that, so far as we are aware, actually, no other EU member state currently allows non-nationals to vote in national elections, beside Ireland's, which has a long-standing bilateral agreement with the UK. So we do think our approach is a reasonable one.
Cat Smith.
Speaker, in the Minister's answer, she acknowledged the contribution that EU citizens have made here in Britain, and of course EU citizens currently under transition have the right to vote and stand for election at local level. Many EU nationals are currently serving as local councillors up and down this country for all political parties. What commitment can she make that those EU nationals who currently serve in local government as locally elected councillors will be able to continue to serve their term of office, complete their term of office, and will she be able to give them any guidance as to whether or not they'll be able to seek re-election and their communities be able to re-elect them to continue to serve the communities that they're currently doing so?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I am absolutely confident the Honourable Lady is a close reader of all parliamentary questions that are submitted to this House and answered to this House, and she will already know that we have placed on record the answer to that question, which is that those who are elected to office will be able to serve their full term. That will also apply to those who were elected before 2020. As I say, I have put this out in answer to an earlier parliamentary question so that the House is clear. That is that EU citizens will be able to vote and stand in the May elections coming up this year.
Owen Thompson.
Number 11, please.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Code of Conduct for Special Advisers clearly outlines the standards of behaviour and conduct required of Special Advisers throughout their appointment. Where it may be suspected that an individual has failed to meet those standards, agreed disciplinary processes are carried out in line with the terms of the Model Contract for Special Advisers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Code of Conduct says that Special Advisers must not involve themselves with controversy. After calling for weirdos, misfits and PJ Masks, Dominic Cummings hired someone who's promoted eugenics. How is this acceptable?
Here, and Michael should...
Mr. Speaker, there is little to add to what the Prime Minister already said on this matter yesterday, which is that those views of Mr Sabisky have no place in this government. Mr Sabisky himself has left the employment of government. I don't think there is more to be said on that matter, other than that they are not my views either.
John Trickett.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. And talking of Mr Sabisky, no doubt that the Minister does agree with the Business Minister, who said that his views were offensive and racist. But then, how come such a man was employed to work in Downing Street?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I do not think there is anything to be gained here by going into individuals' employment instances. I can assure the House once again that those views are not shared by anybody on the Treasury bench, and I'm sure we would all agree on that.
John Trickett.
Thank you. Well, that's all waffle, isn't it? The truth is that a right-wing extremist sat in official meetings with the Prime Minister and with defence staff, and that is the fact. When the political operation in number 10 is out of control, that's a problem for politicians, the front bench. But when the vetting system breaks down or is sidestepped, isn't it a problem for the national security?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, does the Labour Party honestly expect me to say from this dispatch box that the vetting system does not work? That would be a breach of national security. I am not going to do any such thing. He ought to ask better questions than that.
Peter Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't one of the ways to solve the problem regarding the issue that the question raises is have special advisors, or at least senior special advisors, who in some cases are more powerful than cabinet ministers? Why don't we do what we do with other appointments, have pre-appointment scrutiny and make the candidates appear before a select committee before their appointment?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I already referred to in my opening point on this question, the Code of Conduct is very clear about what is required, the model contract likewise, and there it is that, it is found in those documents. The appointment procedure for special advisers. The fact is that that ministers take decisions. The Prime Minister takes decisions about who is to be appointed in his team. That is as it should be. Ministers decide and advisers advise. And whilst I welcome his considered point about the processes that could be added to this, I think the processes in place are already adequate, and again, this has been answered already by the Prime Minister yesterday.
Mr. Speaker, well, the Minister's just been very clear that ministers and indeed the Prime Minister decide, and she'll be familiar with the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, the Code for Ministers, and of course the Code for Special Advisers, which says very clearly in Section 9, all appointments of special advisers require the prior written approval of the Prime Minister. So did the Prime Minister give prior written approval for Andrew Sabisky? Yes or no?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's not the right question because Mr. Sabisky was a contractor.
Felicity Buchan.
Number 12, please.
Minister.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to answer questions 12, 16 and 18 together. The Government is committed to delivering value for money, including from the additional £100 billion of investment in infrastructure that we have recently announced. This means that spending won't just be narrowly focused on where it brings the highest immediate economic return, but also on where it may unlock productive potential in the future.
Felicity Buchan.
Thank you. In London, under the stewardship of TfL and the Mayor of London, Crossrail is £2.5 billion over budget and 2.5 years behind schedule. Will my right honourable friend ensure that these mistakes are not made elsewhere in the country?
Well, I know this is a frustration for her constituents. The Infrastructure and Project Authority has worked with the Department of Transport and across government to identify and implement the key lessons to be learned from such major projects. And the authority provides challenge that is fair and accurate through an independent assurance review of major government projects.
Chris Loder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend assure me of the Government's commitment to vital rail infrastructure funding for Dorset and surrounding counties when we have a 3-hourly rail frequency in our county and it takes us 3 hours to get to London almost as well?
Well, can I pay tribute to my honourable friend on both his election but also, as the whole House is aware, him going above and beyond the call of duty and ensuring that his constituents could use train services in the recent strikes. As I say, we are investing an additional £100 billion in infrastructure, and we're looking to make sure we're prioritising the right projects, taking a whole network and whole life value approach, and his representations have been well made and they are being listened to.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now that HS2 has been approved, how will my right honourable friend absolutely ensure, if necessary working with ministers from other departments, that costs are firmly controlled so that all taxpayers nationwide, including in the Aylesbury constituency through which this line unfortunately runs, they can be confident that they have received value for money?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very valid point, and the Department of Transport is leading, obviously, on the delivery of HS2. The Infrastructure and Project Authority will continue to work with them to support the delivery of this initiative through expert advice and challenge in those independent assurance reviews. And the recent review and recommendations into HS2 are very focused on ensuring that costs are controlled and there will be no further delays.
Martin.
Number 14.
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have regular meetings with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for International Trade, covering a number of issues, not least of which are our border arrangements. And import controls are necessary to keep our borders safe and secure and to ensure that we treat all partners equally, especially when it involves collecting the right customs, VAT and other excise duties.
Sounds good. Martin Day.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the Minister answering the question. During the referendum, however, the Chancellor of the Duchy said we would be part of a free trade zone from Iceland to the Russian border, with full access to the EU market. But this month he's been clear that we will lose frictionless trade, and that will introduce red tape and vast impacts on our businesses. How can businesses trust his future pronouncements, and can he clarify when he abandoned the idea of frictionless trade?
The whole point of our negotiations with the European Union now that we have left is to ensure that we do have a comprehensive free trade agreement which ensure that there will be no tariffs, no quotas or quantitative restrictions that is entirely consistent with the broader approach towards free trade which does indeed exist from Iceland to the Russian border.
Beth Winter.
Number 15, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
No.
Beth Winter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you will be aware, my country of Wales, along with Scotland, has already passed legislation to give young people aged 16 the vote. It's a positive move and is the right thing to do, enabling young people to engage in the political process and influence decisions affecting their lives. Surely it's time that you followed our excellent lead and listened to what young people want. It's their future after all.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for making that point, and of course it's in...
was a grouping that you failed to mention. You were too quick with the no, and I think if you could say you'd take the other question as well would be helpful. Second.
No and no.
No and no, not
No, we need the number.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will take questions. If you let me, I will take the question from the member for Weaver Vale as well as the question from the member for Cunnan Valley, and I'm afraid it's a no to both.
Mike Finsbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, if it's good enough for the Welsh, it's good enough for the Scottish, then why on earth are 16 and 17-year-olds not entitled to the vote in England and indeed in Northern Ireland? This is a question of equality. If you go to war for the country, if you can pay your taxes for the country, then extend the franchise from Peterloo to extending the franchise to the women through women's suffrage. The North West has a proud history with extending the franchise. Come on, do the right thing for the English Minister. Give 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote, and indeed in Northern Ireland as well.
Secretary of State.
That was a brilliant question in the style of Orator Henry Hunt at Peterloo. But I'm afraid that we have to accept that in this country, in our United Kingdom, the devolved administrations, they quite rightly make decisions within their competence, but the UK government has no intention of altering the franchise in the way that he suggests. We are getting on with the people's priorities, investing in our NHS, investing in fighting crime, improving education and levelling up the economy. These are more important than constitutional changes.
Rob Roberts.
Question 20, sir.
Minister.
The Government has a commitment to pay 90% of valid and undisputed invoices from SMEs within 5 days. Departments also have a non-exec director responsible for prompt payment, and suppliers now risk being excluded from winning large government contracts if they cannot demonstrate the prompt payment in their supply chain.
Rob. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Minister for
that answer. Following on from responses to my honourable friends earlier regarding small and medium-sized businesses, those businesses' cash flow is obviously the most important factor in their survival. So what assurances can my right honourable friend give me that the timely payment will always extend further down the chain so that those small and medium-sized businesses in my Delling constituency are able to plan ahead with confidence?
I can give him those assurances. We do take those things into account, and I can tell him that as far as the Cabinet Office is concerned, and of course many other departments across government, we are meeting the target on 5 days payment, and in 99% of cases all invoices are paid within 30 days.
Right, we now come to topical questions. Rosie Duffield. Not here, so I'll now Owen Thompson.
Question 2.
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Next week we'll be starting negotiations with the EU on a future relationship, and I'll shortly make a statement to the House on our approach. But whatever the outcome of these negotiations, the transition period will end at the end of this year. We're working closely with businesses and border groups on preparations for the end of the transition period, and I'll be meeting with representatives from our ports, freight and haulage sectors later today. I also want to take the opportunity to welcome to the front bench my strengthened and hugely talented ministerial team, and I look forward to working with them to deliver on our priorities in the months ahead, overseeing the transition period, strengthening the integrity of our precious union, ensuring our constitution is fit for the 21st century, and reforming our civil service and our public sector in line with the people's priorities.
Owen Thompson.
Mr. Speaker, in Scotland, the SNP's Scottish Government's groundbreaking legislation ensures everyone who chooses to make their home in Scotland can vote, including refugees and EU citizens. This follows up enabling votes at 16, which the Government continued to oppose here. Will he now look to follow the lead of the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament towards a more inclusive democracy, or has this Government given up entirely in democracy?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for outlining the approach to the franchise which the Scottish Government takes, but I think one of the most important lessons that democracy teaches us is that we must respect votes. And of course Scotland voted to remain part of the United Kingdom in the referendum in 2014, and I'm afraid his party still refuses to acknowledge the legitimacy of that referendum.
Angela Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to hear my right honourable friend affirm his commitment to strengthening our precious union. Would he be happy to expand on how he would like to do that?
Can I thank my honourable friend for asking that question? The truth is that our United Kingdom is proof positive that a union of nations is stronger together, and it's important that we ensure that the benefits of our union are spread equally, and that means making sure that public sector jobs are deployed effectively in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. It also means that the strength of our exchequer, the foundation that our economy provides for human flourishing across these islands, all of these things are reflective of the strength of our union, the single most successful political union and enterprise that anyone has seen on this earth, and that is why it is so important that we fight for it, from Fermanagh to Forfar and to every part of England and Wales as well.
Cat Smith.
Why is the Secretary of State scared of 16 and 17-year-olds?
Secretary of State.
As the father of a 16 and a 17-year-old, I can assure you I'm not in the least scared of them.
Clackatina.
I'm very proud to be part of a party that's delivering on leaving the EU and that's investing billions in our health and education sectors. Could my right honourable friend outline the steps his department is taking on public procurement to make sure that that money is spent wisely?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that excellent question. She will be aware that leaving the EU is a golden opportunity to reform our procurement rules. We must cut red tape, we must drive innovation and make it easier for small businesses to win those public sector contracts. And we're going to achieve this by creating a bespoke system for British businesses that also complies with our international obligations.
Pete Wishart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, and explicitly the Secretary of State on this question, what role has Dominic Cummings have in the Cabinet Office, and can he outline his professional and personal relationship with them?
Secretary of State.
Well, the gentleman concerned is a special advisor who works for the Prime Minister. All special advisors work for the Prime Minister. I have the highest regard for the special advisors who do such a wonderful job supporting the government and the delivery of the people's priorities.
Pete Wishart.
So answer. Yesterday, The former Chancellor said he had resigned because of the interference of Dominic Cummings in the working arrangements of what is the second Office of State. Never before has such a senior member of government resigned because of the dictates of an unelected official. Is it now Mr Cummings and his weirdos and misfits that are running this government? How many other Sabiskis are lurking around in government departments? And how does the right honourable gentleman now fit in to the operation and the mechanics of government?
Secretary of State.
Again, can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question? Forgive me. Only a matter of time, I suspect. But the broader point is that the Cabinet Office, the Treasury and Number 10 work seamlessly together in order to ensure that the wishes of the British people as expressed in the last general election to strengthen our United Kingdom, to level up our economy and to make sure that people have the opportunity to excel in every sphere, that work is carried on with harmony, unity and energy.
David Davis.
Given the ridiculous bluster and sabre-rattling we've heard from the European Commission in the last few days, what assessment has the government made of the damage the European Union would do to its own economy if it denied itself access to the United Kingdom market?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a characteristically acute point. It is the case that the European Union exports more in goods to the UK than we export to the EU. Were some voices, and I stress there are a minority of voices in the European Union to prevail, and were they not to progress these negotiations in the way I'm sure that we would all want to see, then there would be damage to the EU's economy, and that is the last thing that I would want to see.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Government intend to legislate for the proposals in the 2018 review of parliamentary constituency boundaries or conduct a new review?
Mr Speaker, we were clear in our manifesto that we are committed to equal and updated boundaries, and we will be bringing forward proposals in due course as to how to meet that commitment.
William Ragg.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In February 2019, the Deputy National Statistician said that for the census to go ahead as planned in March 2021, the legislation needs to be passed this April. Does my honourable friend agree that delays to the laying of the census order now mean it's impossible for that legislation to be passed before April? And what are they doing to ensure the census will take place in March next year?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend has clearly already got himself into the detail of the department in the most admirable way that we would expect from the new chair. He is right that this legislation is pressing, and he is absolutely right that behind it sits a very large programme being delivered by the UKSA, on which I work closely with that body. We will be bringing forward the order very shortly to Parliament, and I look forward to its scrutiny in this place so that we can have a successful census in 2021.
Bill Estes.
Was Andrew Sabisky recruited to work on the Defence and Security Review, which the Prime Minister announced yesterday? Yes or no will do.
Secretary of State.
Mr Sabisky was dismissed before the review embarked on its work.
Richard Bacon.
Mr Speaker, does the Chancellor of the Duchy not think it's very odd that the very people who want votes for 16-year-olds changed the law so that 16-year-olds couldn't buy a cigarette or go into a tanning salon? And doesn't that reveal just how empty their aspirations are?
Well, Secretary of State.
In typically pithy fashion, my honourable friend draws attention to the fact that when we're looking at the whole question of when people reach the age of maturity, the landscape is a complicated one. The last Labour government, led by Ed Balls, introduced the raising of the participation age in education to ensure that 17 and 18-year-olds had to be in employment, education or training. That was a welcome recognition of the need to ensure that we supported young people to be everything that they can be at the appropriate moment. This government is committed to ensuring that young people have the right opportunity, but it is important to acknowledge that, for example, even though young people can apply to join the services at the age of 16, they cannot be deployed in a battlefield situation until they are at least the age of 18. So it is important when discussing 16, 17 and 18-year-olds to appreciate the complexity of the position and to show sensitivity when discussing these matters.
Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm sure the Secretary of State would agree with me that when it comes to Andrew Sabisky, we should call a spade a spade. Can the Secretary of State confirm whether someone who is appointed to the Government as a political advisor, even on a contractor basis, is in any way exempt from the spade vetting process or the requirement for Prime Ministerial approval?
As my honourable friend pointed out earlier, there is a difference between special advisers who are appointed by the Prime Minister and work to the Prime Minister and contractors who exist in all government departments.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Why doesn't he prevent enterprises from bidding for government contracts unless they can demonstrate a record of having paid their suppliers on time?
Minister.
Well, they do have to demonstrate this, and if they are already suppliers and they are not complying with the targets that we have set out, they are booted off the supplier list.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did a quick Google search this morning for government jobs. Other search engines are available, and it came up with dozens of government positions described as inside IR35. Now, this is the worst of both worlds. You get taxed as an employee, but you have no employment rights. Do the department agree that that's actually an untenable state of affairs for people working for government?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman raises a thoughtful point. He will be aware that there has been a review led by Her Majesty's Treasury on these rules. I think we would all agree that what we want to see is employees treated accurately and fairly, whichever category they fall in, and of course that the public purse is protected in terms of taxes being correctly brought in and made available for public services. I'll be happy to look in slightly more detail at what he raises if he thinks there's something there beyond that.
Stuart Anderson.
Can my honourable friend tell me what he's doing at the moment about the current combat stress situation?
I pay tribute to Combat Stress, the immense work they've done over many years for those who suffer with mental health challenges when they return from operations. The situation is a difficult situation. There is no doubt that the model of healthcare for our veterans in this country is fundamentally changing to a realisation of the responsibility that the NHS has towards those who serve. Within that model of care, there is a role for everybody, and as we undergo that transition, the services are available, and I'm monitoring the uptake of them every single day.
Rosie Duffield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Apologies for not being in my place earlier. Since 2017, and under successive Tory governments, leaks from civil servants have apparently become commonplace. Has the Minister or the Government carried out an assessment as to why so many civil servants now seem to believe it's in the public interest to go behind the backs of ministers to leak information?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising that question. It is, of course, the case that civil servants have to abide by the Civil Service Code, and we deprecate the leaking of any government information. I'll reflect hard on the point behind the question that the Honourable Lady makes.
Bernard Jenkins.
Can I declare an interest as a Vice President of Combat Stress? And can I just point out that Combat Stress is facing a crisis because the government is withdrawing its funding for the 1,200 or so veterans that use its services every year. And there is now an incidence of a veteran taking their own life because they were refused treatment by Combat Stress and referred back to their GP. This is a very serious situation. Will my honourable friend please make sure that Combat Stress gets the funding that it needs in order to deliver the care to the veterans that it looks after?
Minister.
I pay tribute to my honourable friend and his work with combat stress. The reality is that combat stress is facing challenges at this time, not exclusively because of challenges around contracts from the government. That is reflected across the third sector as well, because mental health care is changing. We must always be driven by the evidence, what works, and how we can access and treat more and more people as awareness of mental health goes up. I've met with Combat Stress a number of times. I've met with my honourable friend on this issue. I'm happy to continue meeting to find a solution to what is a very difficult problem, which is not always, the answer is not always to these problems throwing the requisite money at it and hoping the problem gets better.
Lord Russell.
Thank you. The Minister, to my question earlier on, said that no other European country grants non-citizens voting rights. I think that might have been slightly erroneous. Portugal grants Brazilians that meet a certain threshold voting rights at the national level, as does the Nordic Passport Union in Scandinavian countries. So will the Minister think again about our out-of-place system, where people who could have lived here for 20-odd years, paid tax here, even people who could have been born here, are not able to vote here? At least let's open the conversation.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for that information. To be clear, in terms of what I had said that so far as I was aware, that was the case. So I'm grateful for him for giving two further examples to the debate. And he's right that we should. We should be aware of such examples and have that conversation. But I think the government stance is as I set out earlier on, which is that we think it is reasonable and right to focus on the voters who are currently enfranchised by the Representation of the People Act. And I would further add that I think citizenship restrictions are commonplace for participation in national elections across not only the EU but actually most democracies. I do think the weight of evidence is with the government's position here. I would add, of course, that we do intend to make sure that British citizens around the world who may have travelled far from Britain but are nonetheless still British citizens should be enabled to vote in elections, and we intend to be taking forward that policy. And this is all to say that we think that we think that that is how our democracy should be run. I look forward to speaking further with him on this. I understand he too has joined the Select Committee, again, as is on the order paper this morning. So I look forward to furthers of these discussions as time goes on.
David Jones.
Welsh companies wishing to bid for public contracts in Wales frequently find themselves unable to do so because of EU procurement requirements. Can my right honourable friend confirm that post the implementation period, procurement regulations will be changed to enable Welsh companies to bid for contracts in Wales?
Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. There are some big opportunities for us to change those procurement rules. I have already had conversations with the devolved nations. I'll be visiting the devolved nations very shortly to take forward and to listen to the ideas of businesses to ensure that those new rules and regimes around them reflect their needs.
Stephen Deutscher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster might want to be very careful with the answers he gives to this House about Mr. Sabisky in relation to the Defence and Security Review, as my honourable friend from Sefton raised a moment ago, because he will well know that there have been teams of civil servants working on that review for some time. It didn't just start yesterday when the Prime Minister announced it. So can he answer a question? Did Mr. Sabisky meet with any of the officials working on the Defence and Security Review? Yes or no?
Secretary of State.
I've no idea.
Joe Gideon.
Thank you. I welcome. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the veterans' interview guarantee. But I've spoken to a number of veterans in Stoke-on-Trent Central, where we have quite a number, and I think that sometimes the issue is pre-employment, so that they need help to prepare for being ready for an interview. Can the Minister give some ideas whether we can support them on that? Thank you.
So preparing those who've served for civilian life is a huge part of what we do. We put a lot of money into something called the Career Transition Partnership. The statistics out today show that we've got an 86% employment rate, continues to rise year on year. We've got a higher employment rate than the civilian cohort. We're not resting on our laurels, and we will continue to do all we can in that pre-phase before individuals leave service to make sure that they have the best opportunity possible of making the most of their skills when they rejoin civilian life.
We now come to the ministerial statement. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Minister for the Cabinet Office on future relationships with the EU. Secretary of State.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like now to make a statement on the Government's approach to our future relationship with the European Union. Now that Britain has left the EU, we're entering a new chapter in the history of these islands. This Government has honoured the clearly expressed wish of the British people. Their instruction to us, their servants, to secure our departure from the EU has been followed. The votes of 17.4 million people, more than have ever voted for any democratic proposition in our history, were implemented on January the 31st, and we are now on a new journey. As a sovereign, self-governing, independent nation, we will have the freedom to frame our own laws, control our own borders, lower all our taxes, set our own tariffs, determine our own trade relationships, and ensure that we follow the people's priorities on security, the economy, and democratic accountability. Over the next 9 months, we will negotiate a new relationship with our friends and partners in the EU, based on free trade and friendly cooperation. We have today published the approach for these negotiations, and copies of the document, the future relationship with the EU, were made available to members in the Vote Office from 9:30 a.m. Talks with the EU on our future relationship begin next week, and it is our aim to secure a comprehensive free trade agreement, as well as agreement on questions such as fisheries, internal security and aviation. We're confident that those negotiations will lead to outcomes which work for both the UK and the EU. But this House, our European partners, and above all, the British people should be in no doubt. At the end of the transition period, on the 31st of December, the United Kingdom will fully recover its economic and political independence. We want the best possible trading relationship with the EU, but in pursuit of a deal, we will not trade away our sovereignty. The government's vision for the UK's future relationship with the EU was outlined with crystal clarity by the Prime Minister during the general election campaign, and the election result comprehensively confirmed public support for our direction of travel. And in his speech in the Painted Hall in Greenwich on February the 3rd, the Prime Minister laid out in detail how we will reach our destination. The first principle of our approach is that we wish to secure a relationship based on friendly cooperation between sovereign equals. We respect the EU's sovereignty, autonomy and distinctive legal order, and we expect them to respect ours. We will not accept nor agree to any obligations where our laws are aligned with the EU or the EU's institutions, including the Court of Justice. Instead, each party will respect the other's independence and the right to manage its own borders, immigration policy and taxes. The second and allied principle of our approach is that we will seek to emulate and build on the types of relationship that the EU already has with other independent sovereign states. We will use precedents already well established and well understood to ensure that both sides' sovereignty is respected. And by using already existing precedents, we should be able to expedite agreement. We will seek functioning arrangements that the EU will recognise from its many other relationships. So our proposal draws on existing EU agreements, such as the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement with Canada, the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, and the EU-South Korea Free Trade Agreement. This approach should enable us to move swiftly towards the goal envisaged in the political declaration agreed last October, in which both sides set the aim of concluding a zero tariffs, zero quotas free trade agreement, or FTA. And as well as concluding a full FTA, we will require a wholly separate agreement on fisheries. We will take back control of our waters as an independent coastal state, and we will not link access to our waters to access to EU markets. Our fishing waters are our sovereign resource, and we will determine other countries' access to our resources on our terms. We also hope to conclude an agreement on law enforcement and judicial cooperation in criminal matters, so that we can work with the EU to protect their citizens and ours from shared threats. But we will not allow our own legal order to be compromised. And by taking back full control of our borders, we can implement measures to make the British people even safer, and we can tackle terrorism and organised crime even more effectively. We also wish to conclude a number of technical agreements covering aviation and civil nuclear cooperation, which will help ensure continuity for the UK on its new footing as an independent sovereign nation. Now, securing agreement on all these questions should not, in principle, be difficult. We are, after all, only seeking relationships with the EU which it has with other nations, relationships that respect the interests and the sovereignty of both partners. And it's in that light that we should view discussions about what has been termed the level playing field. It has been argued that EU demands in this area will make full agreement difficult. Yet there's no intrinsic reason why requirements that both parties uphold desirable standards should prejudice any deal. The United Kingdom has a proud record when it comes to environmental enhancement, workers' rights and social protection. In a number of key areas, we either exceed EU standards or have led the way to improve standards. On workers' rights, for example, the UK offers a year of maternity leave, with the option to convert this to parental leave so that both parents can share care. The EU minimum is just 14 weeks. And on environmental standards, we were the first country in the world to introduce legally binding greenhouse gas emission reduction targets through the Climate Change Act. We were also the first major global economy to set a legally binding target to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions across the economy by 2050. We will not dilute any existing protections. Indeed, as the Environment Bill debated yesterday demonstrates, we wish to go further and faster than the EU in improving the natural environment. We do not need the EU's permission to be a liberal nation leading the world in the fight against climate change and for social progress. And that is why the UK government seeks an FTA with robust protections for the environment and labour standards. But we do not see why the test of suitability in these areas should be adherence to EU law and submission to EU models of governance. The EU does not apply those principles to free trade agreements with other sovereign nations, and they should not apply to a sovereign United Kingdom. Some argue that we must accept EU procedures as the benchmark because of the scale of UK trade with the EU. But the volume of UK trade with the EU is no greater than the volume of US trade with the EU, and the EU was more than willing to offer zero tariff access to the US without the application of EU procedures to US standard setting. And the EU has also argued the UK is a unique case, owing to its geographical location. But proximity is not a determining factor in any other FTA between other neighbouring states with large economies. It's not a reason for us to accept EU rules and regulations. You need only to look at the USMCA agreement between the US, Canada and Mexico for an example of a trade agreement that does not require regulatory alignment to one side's rules or demand a role for one side's courts. Geography is no reason to undermine democracy. To be clear, we will not be seeking to dynamically align with EU rules on EU terms governed by EU laws and EU institutions. The British people voted to take back control, to bring power home, to have the rules governing this country made by those who are directly accountable to the people of this country. And that is what we are delivering. Mr. Speaker, the negotiations are due to begin next week, led by the Prime Minister's Sherpa David Frost. And I'd like to end by looking ahead optimistically to the coming months. There is ample time during the transition period to strike the right deal for the UK. We hope to reach a broad agreement ahead of the EU Council's high-level summit in June, whereupon we will take stock. We know our proposals are measured and our approach is fair. We know what we want to achieve. We're ready to go. And this government is committed to establishing the future relationship in ways that benefit the whole of the UK and strengthen the Union. We're committed to working with the devolved administrations to deliver a future relationship with the EU that works for the whole of the UK. And may I take this opportunity to reassure colleagues that our negotiation will be undertaken without prejudice and with full respect to the Northern Ireland Protocol. This government will act in these negotiations on behalf of all of the territories for whose international relations the UK is responsible. And in negotiating the future relationship between these territories and the EU, the UK government will seek outcomes that support the territories' security and economic interests and reflect their unique characteristics. And, as the Prime Minister committed to do at the second reading of the Withdrawal Agreement Act, we'll keep Parliament fully informed about the negotiations and colleagues will be able to scrutinise our progress. Mr. Speaker, this government is delivering on its manifesto commitments with energy and determination. This government got Brexit done, and we will use our recovered sovereignty to be a force for good in the world and a fairer nation at home. We want and we will always seek the best possible relationship with our friends and allies in Europe, but we will always put the welfare of the British people first. And that means ensuring the British people exercise the democratic control over our destiny for which they voted so decisively. That compact with the people is the most important deal of all, and in that spirit, I commend this statement to the House.
Paul Blomfield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for the Cabinet Office for prior sight of his statement. He talks about having got Brexit done, but he knows that's not the case. We have taken the first step in leaving the European Union, but Brexit, as he knows, is far from done. And the government's ambition for our new relationship with our most important trading partner is frankly underwhelming. They started with a commitment to securing the exact same benefits, then scaled it back to frictionless trade to protect our vital supply chains. Then it was Canada plus, plus, plus. Now it's Canada so long as that doesn't get in the way of ending our alignment with the standards that we've previously enjoyed. Now, the Minister talked about the government's mandate in the general election, which was based on a withdrawal agreement and a political declaration which says that a free trade agreement will be, and I quote, underpinned by provisions ensuring a level playing field, which they now apparently reject. The Minister spoke of higher UK standards than are required within the EU, and he's right. There are some examples, there are also country examples, but EU standards are a floor, not a ceiling. So can I ask the Minister, if the government have no intention of falling below those standards, why are they unwilling to make that commitment? Mr. Speaker, I spent Monday evening with manufacturing companies from across the north of England. They are not worried about alignment. Indeed, they want it. They're concerned about the barriers to trade undermining their position in the crucial European market. Now, I know that the Prime Minister has made his contempt for the views of business well known. But will the government not think again at this crucial moment, because they are taking serious risks with our economy, with people's jobs and with their livelihoods? The Treasury's analysis from November 2018 predicted a Canada-style FTA would shrink the economy by up to 6.4%. Now, I know they've rubbished their own analysis already, but what new analysis have they done? So can I ask the Secretary of State, will the government publish a full economic impact assessment of the deal that they are seeking? And will they also publish the assessment of the other trade deals that he mentioned? A recent FTO revealed the Department for International Trade has commissioned and received but not yet published assessments of the impact on the UK economy, of the FTA with the US, with Japan and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So will he commit to publishing those impact assessments immediately? Now, the government has told us time and again that, the Prime Minister has told us time and again that his Brexit deal represents stability and certainty for business. But in ruling out extending the transition period, the government is taking business from one set of uncertainties to a new set. They're expecting to complete enormously complex negotiations in just 10 months, with a cavalier disregard for the consequences of failing to do so. The Minister's warning to business that customs checks are inevitable and that almost everybody will face extra barriers at the border is deeply concerning. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the one place where the government claims that there will not be checks for GB trade with Northern Ireland is the only place that they have actually so far committed to having them down the Irish Sea. So can the Minister clarify, in the light of the conflicting statements from so many of his colleagues, what will be the extent of checks along the border they have now created down the Irish Sea? Mr. Speaker, Labour wants the best deal for Britain in trade, in security and in all of the other areas mentioned by the Minister. That means maintaining the closest possible relationship with our most important trading partner, and it is on that to which we will hold this government to account.
Secretary of State.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his questions on the constructive way in which he approaches these matters. The first thing to stress is that this government is wholly committed to implementing the withdrawal agreement, to respecting and enacting the protocol with respect to Northern Ireland, and also to giving effect to the political declaration, and specifically the political declaration's aim that we secure a comprehensive free trade agreement without tariffs, quotas and quantitative restrictions. He asked specifically about the maintenance of standards and the requirement that we follow EU law and ECJ judgments in order to ensure that workers' rights and environmental protections are there secure. We do not believe that that is necessary. It is not the case that the EU requires of any other sovereign independent state submission to its legal order. Ultimately, the best guarantor of environmental protection and workers' rights is a sovereign UK Parliament determined to lead in the world, as this government is doing in those areas. He asked about manufacturing. It is vitally important that we ensure that our manufacturing sector, like all sectors of our economy, is equipped to take advantage of new economic opportunities. That is what this government is doing. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, will be saying more about how we can supercharge every part of our economy when he delivers the budget statement on the 11th of March. But the free trade agreement that we seek should ensure exactly the tariff-free access to markets and, indeed, the provisions on rules of origin that will allow the manufacturing sector to flourish in the future. He makes the point that the need to ensure that negotiations are concluded by the end of the transition period on the 31st of December necessarily means that negotiations will have to proceed at pace. They will. But as I pointed out, and as he acknowledges, because all we are seeking are relationships for which there's already a precedent between the EU and other countries, precedents that exist between the EU and Canada, Japan, South Korea and others, it should be possible to make rapid progress. And I noticed that my good friend, Dr. Martin Zellmeyer, who is now the EU representative in Austria and who previously worked for the President of the Commission, has said that it would be entirely possible to conclude these negotiations in a timely fashion. And Dr. Zellmeyer and I, not for the last time, are in complete agreement on that issue. And he makes the point about customs checks and a border down the Irish Sea. There will be no border down the Irish Sea. We will make sure that there is unfettered access for Northern Ireland businesses to the rest of the United Kingdom. The problem for the Labour Party, and I acknowledge the sincere beliefs and the commitment of the honourable gentleman to appropriate scrutiny, but the problem for the Labour Party more broadly is that their approach on Europe would mean that we would have no control over our fishing waters, no effective control over our borders, no way of charting our own independent economic destiny. And looking at that proposal, I'm afraid that all I can say, as someone once said, is no, no, no.
Can I tell the host I'm expecting to run this to 11:30, in which case Ian Duncan.
Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his statement, very clear, and his views that the standards that we set are higher than those of the EU, so he won't be demanding that the EU aligns with our standards as we go forward, which is refreshing. Can I also, however, take him to one point? In the withdrawal agreement, he knows that the settlement around Northern Ireland included state aids, and since then the EU has interpreted this as bringing the whole of the UK under the state aids provisions. Could he confirm that in a future agreement which we will make with them, we will not accept that the UK will leave itself under the Court of Justice when it comes to state aids provisions?
My right honourable friend makes a very important point. Of course we must respect the integrity of the protocol, but it is not the case that CJEU should be governing the application of state aid in the way that some have envisaged and which would be quite wrong.
Wayne David.
Thanks very much.
The Secretary of State's statement has been strong.
Sorry, it should have been Pete Wishart. There's too many people talking at the chair. Pete Wishart.
That's absolutely fine, Mr. Speaker. What a load of bunkum baloney and codswallop. This is nothing other than a route map to the cherished no deal, the real ambition of these Brexit zealots over there. They're even now prepared to break international law in order to achieve this outcome. But let's dispense with the unicornism and let's try and see if we could start to make sense with the real world and what we're actually dealing with. The EU expect nothing other than the political declaration to be implemented in full. They expect that level playing field to be realised, and they will not accept anything else. How many times does this government need to be told that the UK will not leave with a better deal and arrangement that is currently enjoyed just now? It doesn't matter if it's Canada Plus. It doesn't matter if it's Australia. It doesn't even matter if it's outer space minus. They will have an inferior product at the end of this day and when we have finally got an agreement with the EU. And look at what we're up against. It's the clown shoe UK up against the efficient, effective EU with their negotiating experience. And they're laughing. They're laughing at that, sitting there with the proposals which mean absolutely nothing. They will be trounced by the EU in the negotiating process. Their hard Brexit will do nothing other than hurt my nation. Even with one of these FTAs, our GDP will be hit by 6.1%. And if they get their cherished no deal, the consequences will be absolutely catastrophic for my nation of Scotland. Scotland wanted nothing whatsoever to do with this ruinous Brexit, and we won't accept it. I'm sure, honourable gentlemen who have been laughing and scoffing in this side have seen opinion polls in Scotland. There is now sustained majority support for independence for Scotland. And one of the things that's driving that is all of them saying no to Scotland, for them pursuing their hard Brexit. Scotland's not going to be part of this Secretary of State. We won't accept it. When will you allow us to have a referendum so we could get out of this mad Brexit?
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his remarks. The first thing that I would say is, can I use the opportunity of his remarks to place on the record my thanks to Mike Russell for the Scottish Government for the work that he's done along with leaders from other devolved administrations in helping to shape our approach. Of course it is the case that the Scottish Government and the Welsh Assembly Government will in some areas take a different view from the UK Government, but it's undoubtedly the case that our negotiating position is enhanced as a result of the conversations that we have with our colleagues in the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Government. And indeed a number of changes have been made to our approach and to this document following conversations that I've had with the Scottish Government over the course of the last week. But it is also the case that Scotland, like every part of the United Kingdom, will benefit hugely, not just from our departure from the European Union, but also from the new trading relationships that we will develop with other countries. It is the case, for example, that when we conclude a new free trade agreement with the United States, that Scotland will be one of the sectors that benefits most from the new trading opportunities. But it will also be the case, as the Scottish Government itself has pointed out, that there will be tens of thousands of new jobs created in the north east of Scotland in the fishing sector as a direct result of our departure from the European Union, jobs that would not be created if we followed the SNP approach of staying in the common fisheries policy. And ultimately, the greatest threat to the prosperity and the security of the people of Scotland is the reckless approach that the Scottish Government takes towards the 2014 referendum, their determination to overturn the settled will of the Scottish people to stay in the United Kingdom. Their approach, I'm afraid, would mean that we would have border posts at Berwick and you would not be able to use the pound sterling in sterling. We must give that madness a miss.
Meg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome my right honourable friend's statement. And on the subject of standards, would he agree with me that those that continue to peddle the line that we somehow need to tether ourselves to the EU's rules and standards are in fact making a case to hold Britain back?
My honourable friend is absolutely right.
Wayne David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Secretary of State aware that 60% of the international exports from Wales go to the European Union? And the Welsh Government has said that there must be a level playing field and frictionless trade with the EU in the interests of the Welsh economy. Is he aware of this?
I'm very well aware of the views of the Welsh Assembly Government, thanks to the excellent work done by Jeremy Miles, their Brexit Minister and Counsel General, and I enjoy the conversations that I have with Jeremy, Mark Drakeford and others in order to make sure that we can work together.
John Stevens.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that negotiating a comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU is a priority. However, can the Minister confirm that we will be also looking to reach free trade agreements with other countries? And can he also confirm that such negotiations either are underway now or will be shortly, and that we do actually have the civil service capacity to reach them?
It's a very good point made by my honourable friend, and yes, we do. The Department for International Trade has a team of trade negotiators, lawyers and other policy experts. It is the case that there have already been a number of informal and formal contacts with the United States, Australia, New Zealand and other participants in the CPTPP, and we will be proceeding at pace with negotiations with partners across the globe in order to forge free trade agreements in the interests of every part of the United Kingdom.
Dr Ripaha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Brexit is clearly far from done. It had cost us £130 billion by January, and the average UK household is £900 worse off. Will the Minister tell us what he estimates that price tag to be at the end of this year? And given the gendered impact of trade, where's the equality impact assessment that their statutory duty requires them to do with these things?
It is the case, if one looks at most of the indices of economic performance, like the measures of increased investment and increased capital expenditure recently, that the United Kingdom economy, following on from the Conservative victory in the general election on the 12th of December, is powering ahead. Indeed, powering ahead in comparison to EU nations. I would like to make sure that we get a comprehensive free trade agreement so that other EU nations can benefit from the dynamism of the UK economy, and that men and women across Europe can benefit from the right economic relationship.
Vulcan.
Financial services are critical to the economy of this country, contributing 11% of our total tax take. Will my right honourable friend assure my constituents in Kensington who work in financial services that their interests will be protected during free trade negotiations?
Absolutely. Financial services matter not just in the City of London, but also in Edinburgh, Perth, Leeds and across the United Kingdom. It's a dynamic and growing sector, and it's important that we make sure that we have the right arrangements for them. We hope that the EU will report by June on the prospects for equivalency in financial services. That was a commitment that was made in the political declaration. It did not appear subsequently in the EU's negotiating mandate, but I'm confident that the EU will, by June, have completed those equivalency assessments.
Kevin Bradman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In our future relationship, it's quite important that musicians and performers and so on can move freely and continue to both go to Europe and for European performers to come here on a reciprocal basis. What's his understanding of the government's position in relation to that going forward?
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and he will see that in this document there are details on how we can ensure that those who provide professional services, including artists and musicians, can continue to do so at the end of this transition period. It's critically important that the cultural excellence that so many UK musicians are responsible for continues to be available to European nations, and whether it's the Bayreuth Festival or pop concerts in Belgium, we need to make sure that British talent has a chance to shine.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that an agreement on a future relationship by the end of the year is perfectly feasible, and that the EU and its negotiators need to recognise the reality of a sovereign, independent United Kingdom with a strong, dynamic economy?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of EU leaders who have said that a deal is doable because we're operating on the basis of precedent. Then it should be possible to conclude all the necessary agreements. And I should say that having concluded these agreements by the end of this year, we can then move on to deepening the many bilateral and multilateral relationships that we have with our friends and partners in Europe to the benefit of all.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The right honourable gentleman referred to other deals that he is hoping to emulate. He will be aware that the EU's deal with South Korea took 8 years from the start of negotiations to implementation, and the Canada deal 7 years. Given that the government is seeking a much more comprehensive arrangement than either of those, may I say to him, the proof will be whether his optimism that it can be done and ratified in 10 months remains to be proven. But can he just confirm to the House that if it is not possible to conclude a deal, then we will exit the transition period on the 31st of December with no agreement whatsoever?
Well, we already have an agreement. We have a withdrawal agreement that safeguards the rights of UK and EU citizens, that settles our financial obligations and makes provisions through the protocol for Northern Ireland's position. So we already have an agreement. With respect to the free trade agreements to which he refers, it's obviously more difficult to begin when you are designing a prototype. Now that these prototypes exist and they are no longer prototypes but precedents, it is much, much easier to replicate their provisions.
David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the last question, some 2 years ago, I attended a presentation complete with slides given by Mr. Michel Barnier, at which he indicated that as things then stood, the only post-Brexit trading arrangements available to the UK were those enjoyed by South Korea and, of course, Canada, which is precisely the relationship that the government is seeking. Since then, the EU seems to have resigned from that position. Does my right honourable friend know why the EU is apparently showing such bad faith?
There are, as my right honourable friend, having said with distinction in government, knows, a range of views across the European Union, but they have now concluded their mandate with unanimity, and we are confident that we can negotiate using our approach and their mandate to reach an appropriate deal similar to the one that he has outlined.
Jamie Stone.
Mr Speaker, I have often in this place referred to the concerns of the Highland tourism industry, in particular hotels, about the continuing employment of EU nationals, many of whom are heading homewards, and also the concerns of fresh fish processors in terms of getting their fresh produce to European markets in good time. I wonder the Secretary of State, who is a good Scot, would consider coming to the Highlands to meet with representatives of these industries. He would be most welcome.
I'd be delighted so to do. Any opportunity to visit the honourable gentleman's constituency is a welcome one. He is absolutely right that the hospitality industry is integral to the success of the Highlands economy, and we want to make sure that in the future that those who provide such a high standard of hospitality have access to the skilled labour they need.
Steve Double.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and his very clear message regarding fisheries. But he will know that memories run very deep in our fishing communities, and there is continued great concern because of the way that the fishing industry was treated previously. So will he make absolutely clear to the fishermen in Cornwall and around the country that access to our fishing waters will not be used as a bargaining chip to trade off against other priorities?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Memories of what happened in the 1970s certainly run deep, and for very good reason. And that is why I sought to stress in my remarks that we, as an independent sovereign state, regard control of our own resources as something which we cannot barter away. Of course, we want to cooperate in the management of stocks with our neighbours, but the approach that we will take will be similar to that of other sovereign states or sovereign regimes like Norway, Iceland, and the Faroes, and as an independent coastal state, we will regulate access to our own waters on our terms.
Sir George Hull.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I welcome the Right Honourable Member for Surrey Heath's commitment to try to secure a comprehensive free trade agreement? Will he accept, though, that many of my constituents who work in the automotive industry are seriously worried about the impact of a potential 10% tariff on motor vehicles, and will he undertake to give a firm commitment to make sure that their interests are as protected as much as possible?
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for making that point. Throughout his time in the House, he's been a strong and consistent and powerful voice for the rights of workers. He's absolutely right that those who work in our automotive sector deserve the best possible future, and it's for that reason that we will seek to avoid any tariffs on cars or on automotive products.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. British farmers are proud to produce food to the highest standards, and the British consumer benefits from this. Can my right honourable friend reassure the farmers and the consumers of my constituency of Broadland that these high standards will be maintained in any free trade agreements?
Absolutely. The agriculture bill, which was being introduced by my right honourable friend, the member for Chipping Barnet, which is being carried, whose tenure as Environment Secretary was outstanding, and which is being carried forward by my right honourable friend, the current Secretary of State, will ensure that farmers have a firm foundation on which to plan for the future. It is also the case in all our trading relationships that we will make sure there are appropriate protections for the environment and for animal welfare to ensure that the peerless standards which are set by our farmers are used as a badge of excellence to enable them to do even better in the future.
Jim Shannon.
Mr Speaker, in relation to fishing, can the Secretary of State confirm that fishing fleets and fish processors in Portavogie, my constituency, but also in our Glasgow, Keele and elsewhere, will have the same rights as their fellow fishing fleets and processors in Scotland, Wales and England, and that Northern Ireland will not be disadvantaged by the border down the Irish Sea?
There will be no border down the Irish Sea, and the fishing fleets of Northern Ireland will enjoy all the rights that they deserve, similar, indeed identical, to those of other fishermen and fishers across the United Kingdom.
Crab.
Mr Speaker, striking a deal is far easier and far more likely from a position of strength. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that, in contrast to 2017, going into these negotiations with clarity, unity, backed up by a strong electoral mandate, should give us all reasons for optimism, not pessimism?
Oh, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. And I've said before from this dispatch box that when you had a 52-48 referendum, when you have 650 different views in this House, not everyone will be satisfied with every aspect of our negotiating approach. But with a united government, a clear approach, a general election mandate, and also with this document being underpinned by clear work by lawyers, trade negotiators and others, I believe that we can secure a deal. And I'm sure that across this House, everyone recognises that we should not make our own personal perfect the enemy of the common good.
Matt Fadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The statement and the document published today shows that the government has made a fundamental choice, which is to prioritise sovereignty over any economic argument or consequence, either for goods or for services. But isn't the danger here that, having made this choice, the government imposes economic consequences for the long term on the country in pursuit of the prize of a sovereignty which it ends up not using very much, because at the end of the day, good standards in environmental and labour market and consumer sectors actually make sense?
The right honourable gentleman always makes a thoughtful contribution to our debates, and I do take his point. And it will be for this Parliament and for future Parliaments to decide how our sovereignty is exercised in accordance with the wish of the British people. But the experience of history tells us that those countries which have the maximum amount of control over their own destiny are the best equipped to succeed economically and indeed to ensure a greater degree of equity for all their citizens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend recognise the distinction between EU regulations and European technical standards, the latter of which are set outside the EU and without a loss of sovereignty by expert bodies, of which the British Standards Institution is one of the most respected and admired in the world? And does he share my hope that British standards expertise will continue to be able to influence European and international standards?
My right honourable friend makes an excellent point, which reflects the brilliant work that he did in government as business secretary. It is absolutely the case that there are common technical standards in which British experts play a distinguished part, and we will want to ensure, and I know that others will want to ensure, that those common standards can help underpin successful commerce and trade.
Jonathan Reynolds.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister began by saying the government is not asking for anything which doesn't already exist in an existing agreement between the EU and another country, but then gave an answer on financial services, which the document backs up, saying the government is seeking this enhanced equivalence, comprehensive equivalence regime for our major sector. And the two things, Minister, respectively, cannot be true. There is not one single equivalence regime, it's a patchwork of regulations, and there are major bits of legislation with no equivalence provisions in at all. The cross-border payments regulation, Motor Insurance Distribution Directive, the Single European Payments Area. None of these have equivalence provisions, so we respectively are asking for something additional, and one of the answers the Minister's given isn't really correct.
Well, again, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his thoughtful intervention, but all we are seeking is straightforward equivalence in financial services, and that is something that the European Union has said that they will review, and we will know the conclusions of that review by June.
Well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What an excellent statement from the Secretary of State outlining our principles. But could he give me the assurance that the principles will not change when the EU says no to something? Because over the last few years I've listened to excellent speeches from that dispatch box, only to find our principles changed when the EU said no to something.
I am a restless seeker after consensus, wherever it can be found, but more important than that, I'm a Democrat. The British people were clear in the referendum and clear again in the general election. They wanted us to leave the European Union. The Prime Minister made clear in the general election, as he did during the referendum campaign, that meant leaving the single market, leaving the customs union and leaving the jurisdiction of the ECJ, and we will not move from those principles.
Jonathan Edwards.
Regrettably, the British Government, in its statement today, has decided to take a belligerent approach to the second phase of Brexit negotiations. Its opening move is to try and reopen the agreement reached after the first phase of Brexit and set further arbitrary deadlines for the infinitely more complicated second phase of Brexit dealing with trade. Rather than playing Russian roulette with people's jobs and economic well-being, would it not be better for the government to take a grown-up approach to these negotiations and remove any arbitrary deadlines to the conclusions of the negotiations?
There are no arbitrary deadlines. The deadline for agreement on the 31st of December is in the political declaration. If we were to take that out, we would be altering the political declaration. We're honouring the political declaration, and far from being belligerent, all we are simply doing is setting a deadline. When I was an editor in the world of newspapers, setting a deadline for correspondence was not an exercise in belligerence, it was a way of making sure that we could serve the people.
Or a trot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that we have higher standards in the EU in a number of areas, particularly, I would point out, in maternity, and it might be useful for the EU to recognise this in some of their discourse?
My honourable friend is absolutely bang on. Across the nations and the countries of the continent of Europe, there are different approaches to some of these questions, and it is the case that there are countries outside the European Union, like Norway, that have exemplary standards in environmental protection and also when it comes to maternity and social rights. The UK, like Norway, is a progressive, liberal, modern country, and that is something across this House that we should celebrate, and outside the European Union we can aim even higher.
Grant Davis.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister knows that Canada, South Korea, Japan aren't in the single market. They aren't in the customs union, so we're starting from a different position. And therefore, will he accept that if we do diverge from EU environmental standards and workers' rights, inevitably there'll be restrictions? And so isn't his plan really to lose British jobs and simply blame the EU? And wouldn't it be better to keep up the standards and keep up the trade, because people didn't vote to lose their jobs when they voted to leave the EU?
I completely understand where the honourable gentleman is coming from, but we've had a referendum, we've had a general election. In both, it was very clear that we were going to leave the single market and the customs union, take back control in the interest of the British people.
David Dewitt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the statement and the document to which my right honourable friend refers. I particularly welcome the clarification, the increased clarification and increased detail on the subjects of fisheries, not least that it's going to be wholly, and I'm quoting from the statement, a wholly separate agreement from the free trade agreement, where we'll take back control of our waters as an independent coastal state and will not link access to our waters to access to EU markets. Can my right honourable friend confirm to the House and to the constituents of Banff-and-Buchan, particularly the seafood sector, both catchers and the processing side of the sector, that we will retain sovereignty, we will get the best deal for our fishermen across the United Kingdom, despite the assertions from the EU and despite the seemingly wishful thinking sometimes from the members opposite on SNP benches?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. For folk in Banff-and-Buchan, Murray, and indeed across the United Kingdom, a sea of opportunity beckons when we leave the European Union, and it is a great, great pity that the SNP and the Scottish Government, despite the many talented members that it enjoys, still wants us to remain in the EU and in the common fisheries policy. It's one of a number of ways in which they would sell Scotland short, and it grieves my heart.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just following that response here, to date has governments ignored the vote of Scotland in the referendum, ignored the compromise proposals from the Scottish Government, and are showing they're willing to ride roughshod over the Seoul Convention. Now reneged on his offer, when his Cherry vote leave, that Scotland could have its own immigration policy. Yep. So what one of these aspects is strengthening the so-called precious union?
Well, we are respecting the referendum result. In 2014, the people of Scotland voted to remain in the United Kingdom, and sadly, this is a settled decision which the Scottish Government seeks to unpick to the detriment of all. And then, having voted to be in the United Kingdom, the whole United Kingdom voted to leave whole and entire from the European Union, and we are working to make sure that that democratic decision works in the interests of all.
Stephen Happen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement today? And can I say to him, as he knows, that primarily the UK is a service-based sector economy. And whilst I hear taking back borders means a separate treaty for fishing, which many in coastal communities would welcome, constituents in my constituency of Wimbledon are in financial services and probably represent more than employed by the whole of fishing in the UK. On the basis we've talked about control of our money and taking back control of our money, why not a separate treaty for financial services? And if not, I've heard his comments on equivalence. Will you set out what the government's position on equivalence is in terms of the derivation period?
It is the case, as my honourable friend makes clear, financial services matter not just in Wimbledon but across the United Kingdom, and that is why we want to ensure, as is made clear in the document that we published today, that we wish to conclude an agreement which will make provision for financial stability, market integrity and investor and consumer protection for financial services. And it is also the case that we want to secure mutual recognition of professional qualifications as well, in order to ensure that everyone in our service sector can continue to have access to the opportunities in every market in which they currently work.
Elmore.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Minister for further information in relation to the chapter on digital? In the report, I quote, it says, open, secure and trustworthy online environment and encourage regulatory cooperation. With the government moving to tackle issues around online harms and the platforms, could he set out in more detail what he means by ensuring that there is cooperation on regulation in any future trading agreement?
Yes, absolutely. It is the case, as the honourable gentleman knows, that we are compliant with all the GDPR regulation that the EU introduced, and we want to make sure that we get an equivalency judgment from the EU on data adequacy, and on that basis that we can continue to ensure that the data flows, which are so integral to business and others, can continue in an appropriate way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Right honourable friend's statement, both for the clarity and the optimism included in it. I know the people of Montgomeryshire, and indeed the majority of the people of Wales, will welcome that. Can I ask him to meet with the Welsh farming unions to outline again that we will not be seeking to lower food standards and tackle some of the scaremongering? And indeed, if my right honourable friend wants to do that of a Welsh farmhouse breakfast, we can certainly do that in Montgomeryshire.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for making that point. Whether it's the Farmers Union of Wales or NFU Cymru, farmers in Wales have brilliant representation, including from my honourable friend, the member for Montgomeryshire, and there is nothing nicer than a Welsh farmhouse breakfast, apart from possibly an Ulster fry, or a bacon sandwich in Peterhead Harbour.
Claire Hanna.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister states that the negotiation will take place without prejudice to the Northern Irish Protocol, but there's confusion in Northern Ireland where we hear from the EU that there will be no derogation from the rules, but we have reports over the weekend of your government seeking to find ways around the protocol, and yourself and your colleagues saying that there will still be unfettered access and no border in the Irish Sea. Can the Minister please describe in detail the crystal clarity you've referred to, how these irreconcilable aims will be married up, how people in Northern Ireland will finally get certainty after 3.5 years of bluster and stalled investment, and will he clarify what form the negotiation with the devolved administration will take?
Far from there being confusion, I hope that there is clarity that we will implement the withdrawal agreement, respect the Northern Ireland Protocol, and then conclude a comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union that will work in the interests of the people of Northern Ireland and people across the United Kingdom. It is the case that I've had profitable conversations with both the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister in the preparation of our approach today. We won't always agree with every party in Northern Ireland, but all parties in Northern Ireland, including her own, have an important role to play in making sure that we deliver for all of the people of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for the reassurance he gives to our fisheries, which is particularly relevant to the fisheries in my constituency, beautiful Hastings and Rye. And does my right honourable friend agree that the point of leaving the EU is to enable us to make our own laws in our own way by politicians which we elect and who are accountable to the British people?
Well, honourable friend gets absolutely to the heart of the matter. Democratic accountability, as outlined brilliantly and eloquently by the father of the member for Leeds Central in this House and elsewhere, is something that all of us should celebrate and that leaving the European Union allows us to enhance.
Green.
Rightly acknowledges the importance of the SIS2 database, which holds many millions of pieces of data on wanted and missing persons, including vulnerable children. The document also says that if progress is not made by June sufficient to suggest that there will be the basis of an agreement by September, the government will begin to make its own preparations for domestic priorities. Can the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster explain how he will protect this country properly if we have to sacrifice the access that we have now to millions of pieces of vital data and rely on an Interpol database that contains only a few 100,000 records?
The Honourable Lady makes a very important point. And it is the case that we would like to continue to have access to not just the Schengen Information System 2 database, but also PRUM, ECRIS and a number of other law enforcement and criminal justice tools. But of course, we will have to see what approach the European Union takes. I'm hopeful that they will take a pragmatic approach because they benefit just as much, if not more, from our participation in these databases as we do. But it is also the case that leaving the European Union does allow us, through control of our own borders and laws, to improve homeland security in a number of ways, and we will always act in the interests of the British people.
Flaxman.
Thank you,
Can my honourable friend confirm that the UK and the EU will trade together under an Australia-style agreement if one cannot be reached by the end of the year?
Friend is absolutely right. We want to have a comprehensive free trade agreement on the model that I've outlined in my statement, but if not, then there are other great countries, including Australia, New Zealand and, of course, the United States, that have a huge volume of trade with the EU without having an agreement of that kind.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You don't level up by damaging foundations, and that's exactly what would happen to the economy by walking away in June, as the government's been briefing this morning. But also, as my honourable friend has said, you would do damage to our security. Now, the document says very clearly there should be no role for the CJEU in resolving UK-EU disputes. So does that mean the government's happy not only to lose access potentially to databases crucial to our security, but also the European arrest warrant?
It is ultimately a question for the EU. We are clear that we want a relationship of sovereign equals. If the EU attaches to that relationship a requirement that we follow the jurisdiction of their courts, that is not a relationship of sovereign equals, and it will be the security of the EU that would be impinged as well. And I am sure that no European politician would willingly want to sacrifice the security of their people by taking anything other than a constructive approach.
Anthony Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I came to this place, I had a job representing the banking industry in negotiations with in the wake of the Brexit referendum with the EU, the European Parliament, the Commission, the Council, as well as the Bank of England and the Treasury, on what sort of relationship we want with the EU after Brexit. And one thing we came to realise quite quickly, as did the Bank of England, and Mark Carney has spoken on this point, that as a global financial centre, to be a rule taker and have no say over our prudential regulation would be a threat to financial stability for the UK. Does my right honourable friend agree that actually we have to be very careful and there's a real threat to becoming a rule taker for financial services?
100% spot on, totally correct.
Speaker, yesterday, as a member of the Defence Select Committee, I heard from Professor Malcolm Charners of RUSI, who stated the risks to the UK's essential alliance relationships are greater now than they have ever been for many decades. So I wonder if the Secretary of State could advise the House why the statement on our future relationships with the European Union and about maintaining and say absolutely nothing about maintaining and improving defence.
Well, when it comes to maintaining and improving defence, we have a network of relationships, including, of course, our membership of NATO, the strongest and most durable alliance for freedom that the world has ever known. But when it also comes to defending this country, one of the most perilous things that we could do would be to follow the Scottish Government's approach of breaking up the United Kingdom and the Scottish Government's approach of unilateral nuclear disarmament. I'm afraid that the SNP's position on defence, like its position on so many other issues, would mean that the Scottish people would be less safe as a direct result of their ideological attachment to separation.
Matthew Pennicook.
Mr. Speaker, in light of the Minister's remarks on level playing field, can I ask him about competition policy and governance arrangements? Is it the government's position that in relation to commitments on workers' rights, on environmental protections, consumer and social standards, that the government would accept them being subject to any dispute resolution mechanism agreed to as part of the wider agreement?
It is the case that there will be... there was a list, I know, that the honourable gentleman put forward. I'll come back to each of those in correspondence. Some of them would be covered by dispute resolution mechanisms, others may not be.
Mr. Speaker, Scotland also cast its biggest ever voting proposition when it voted 62% to remain in the EU. More people in Scotland voted to remain in the EU than voted to remain within the United Kingdom. And also that was using the franchise of the UK government. Had 16 and 17-year-olds been trusted the way we do in Scotland, trust our youth, there would have been a bigger proportion to remain within the EU. Does he truly believe withholding the sovereign right of the Scottish people is a sustainable position going forward? And while protecting the sovereignty of the UK, is he prepared to deny the sovereignty of Scotland?
Well, I know that it is the case that the Scottish Nationalist Party will always... I don't know why... I'm sorry, facts are shields that win a ding, as Robert Brown said. I'm afraid the representatives on that bench are nationalists. They are nationalists. They put the separation of the smashing up of the United Kingdom ahead of anything else. Some of them are personally decent and kind people, but I'm afraid they're nationalists. And the reason they object so much is that when the mask comes off and we recognise the ideological heart of the SNP, they didn't like it up 'em.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If agreement's reached, it's estimated there's going to be a need for about 50,000 new customs officers. Is it feasible to recruit and train that many people in less than 6 months, and who's going to foot the bill for it?
Good question.
Yes, it is, and the government stands behind it.
Stephen Parry.
Does the Minister recognise that even the most far-reaching and comprehensive free trade agreement is sadly still going to see regulatory checks and rules of origin checks down the Irish Sea? And as such, beyond simply giving a rhetorical commitment around the implementation of the protocol, can the Minister assure not just the House but his his negotiating partners in the European Union that the government is actually preparing to implement that protocol?
We will ensure that the protocol is appropriately implemented, and we will also ensure unfettered access for businesses in Northern Ireland to the rest of the UK market.
Patricia.
Mr. Speaker, Brexit will be extremely damaging for Scotland in a whole range of ways. The difference between myself and the Secretary of State is that he's a British nationalist and I'm a Scottish nationalist.
Indeed.
But can he tell me if he thinks that Brexit imposed on Scotland will increase or decrease constitutional tensions across the UK?
Britain leaving the European Union will mean that there is a greater degree of harmony between every part of the United Kingdom. And I recognise that will be a disappointment to the Scottish Nationalist Party in its restless search for grievance, dissension and division. But one of the things that I can't help saying is that even though I profoundly disagree with the SNP, it's so lovely to have so many SNP MPs here in the Westminster Parliament, and I know that for many, many, many years to come there will be representation for Scotland here in Westminster, and that's a lovely thing.
We now come to the next ministerial statement. It's the Lord President of the Council and the Leader of the House of Commons, the Right Honourable Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The business for the week commencing the 2nd of March will include Monday, the 2nd of March, second reading of the Medicines and Medical Devices Bill, followed by procedural motion relating to the High-Speed Rail West Midlands Crew Bill, followed by the House will be asked to agree all outstanding estimates. Tuesday, and welcome Madam Deputy Speaker to the Chair, Tuesday, the 3rd of March, proceedings on the Supply and Appropriation Anticipation and Adjustments Bill, followed by committee and remaining stages of the Prisoners' Disclosure of Information about Victims Bill, followed by motion to approve a statutory instrument relating to the draft statutory parental bereavement pay General Regulations 2020 and draft parental bereavement leave regulations 2020. Wednesday, the 4th of March, Opposition Day, 5th allotted day, there will be a debate on flooding, followed by a debate on health inequalities. Both debates will arise on a motion in the name of the official opposition. Thursday, the 5th of March, general debate on International Women's Day. Friday, the 6th of March, the House will not be sitting. The provisional business for the week commencing the 9th of March will include Monday, the 9th of March, second reading of the Birmingham Commonwealth Games Bill, Lords. Tuesday, the 10th of March, remaining stages of the Telecommunications Infrastructure Leasehold Property Bill. Wednesday, the 11th of March, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, will deliver his budget statement. Thursday, the 12th of March, continuation of the budget debate. Friday, the 13th of March, private members' bills.
Shadow Leader of the House, Valerie Vance.
And on that note, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Leader of the House for the forthcoming business? I'm pleased to see the Committee of Selection have now met and that the select committees are on the order paper. And just to clarify, it had nothing to do with the Labour Party. It was, in fact, the government that were delaying it. I hope the motion will be on the order paper on Monday for the House to approve. Could I ask the Leader of the House also for the list of ministerial responsibilities? There have been a lot of new appointments. And can the Leader of the House confirm that any of the new recruits that come into number 10, including those who are replacing those, particularly in the light of the statement by my honourable friend, the Right Honourable Member for Bromsgrove, and the replacement of his staff, that they have in fact been security vetted and that they won't be given security briefings? I understand someone who's recently been removed from number 10 was not security vetted. They need to go through the proper Cabinet Office procedures. I don't know if the Leader of the House is aware, Madam Deputy Speaker, but the Court of Appeal gave judgment this morning on Heathrow Airport. Could the Leader of the House find time for a statement on Heathrow expansion? If he doesn't, there'll probably be an urgent question, so he might as well just make a statement. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, as the Cabinet Office Briefing Room A and the Cabinet Office Briefing Room B and the Prime Minister's Wellingtons lie unused, the climate emergency is taking its toll on our citizens. They're watching their furniture go down the river. We had a record 632 flood alerts on one day alone. The statement on Monday by the Secretary of State said nothing about repairing the flood defences. The Labour government increased this to 10% a year, but under the Tories this was cut to 1.2%. Now, a Labour government in Wales is looking after the distressed folk by giving them £500 and £1,000 if they don't have insurance. That's practical help. Can he perhaps ask the Welsh Secretary of State, who's going to come to the Chamber later, about the £10 million infrastructure payment, one-off payment that the Government of Wales requires? And I'm sure he'll want to provide time for an updated statement when the Prime Minister visits Shrewsbury this weekend. Madam Deputy Speaker, there's no debate on the Marmot report in government time. He said this: the last decade has seen those in disadvantaged areas face declining health, with life expectancy falling, especially for women. Professor Marmot called the damage to the nation's health shocking. If health has stopped improving, that means society has stopped improving. Now, the Leader of the House can't dismiss Professor Marmot because the Prime Minister said himself yesterday he worked with Professor Marmot. He also said, Professor Marmot said, that employment, good employment, is important. So while the government boasts more employment, there is a massive increase in people on zero contracts. 1 million people, 9% of those under 25, are now on these contracts. Other countries have actually banned these contracts. When will the government have a debate on the perniciousness of these contracts? It's like, for those people on these contracts, like walking a tightrope without a safety net. That's not fair and right. Resorting to volunteer food banks is not a safety net. And why haven't we had a debate on the £7 million contract to private US firms so that they can screen what they're calling our most expensive patients? Can he rule out that people will not be denied treatment? Or are we getting into the deserving and undeserving area? The next step is actually going to be screening people. What is this obsession that this government has on screening people out? So could we have a debate on that? Well, the select committees hopefully will be up and running. Maybe they'll be able to report to the House. We have this absurd situation where the Deputy Health Minister in Iran has got COVID-19, and we have British citizens who are lying in jail having done nothing. Nazanin, Anousheh and Kylie need to come home. They need to have proper treatment. An Iranian MP has said that they should be released on compassionate and humanitarian grounds. Now, maybe this is a job for the United Nations or the World Health Organization, or even my right honourable friend, the member for Skipton and Ripon, who did a fantastic job on Northern Ireland. Maybe he can do some negotiating, as the government don't want to do that on behalf of their British citizens. I'd like the Leader of the House, please, to clarify a point made by my honourable friend, the member for Central Ayrshire. She asked the Secretary of State for Health about those who self-isolate, that they're not penalised. Now, in terms of their employment rights. Now, the Secretary of State actually said only those who self-isolate on medical advice will be protected. Now, we've got many people on 0 hours contract. They won't be protected. They are self-isolating to protect our citizens. Could we have a clarification that everyone, whether they get medical advice or not, will be protected and have their employment rights protected? There was a helpful email from the House authorities on COVID-19 and what members can do. Could the Leader of the House please ensure that up-to-date hand gel is available for public areas like the public gallery and those staff who are interfacing with the public, so that they're also safe? Madam Deputy Speaker, the Speaker's chaplain held a service for Ash Wednesday in St Mary's Undercroft with Father Canon Pat Brown for Ash Wednesday. We're pleased to welcome Canon Patricia Hillis, and she'll be inaugurated next week. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to wish everybody, Welsh or not, a happy St David Day on Sunday.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I noticed that when the Right Honourable Lady gets up to stand, my honourable friend, the member for Wellingborough, whoops in delight, which he doesn't do when I get up to stand. So clearly the the Right Honourable Lady is doing something right. I'm glad to report that select committees will be set up. It has taken longer than anticipated. Inevitably, a reshuffle in the midst of it meant that there were some changes as to who would be on the committees, but that is now going ahead and the government is very keen to get that scrutiny up and running. I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for asking for the list of ministerial responsibilities because it helps me to extract it from the place where it is kept, and that is a useful service to the House. I appreciate that. As regards the vetting of new recruits, I'm glad to say that these sorts of security matters are matters that governments do not go into detail on and never have done, whatever colour they have been of, whether they've been red or blue or in the dim and distant part even yellow, and therefore we would not break from that precedent and tradition. As for Heathrow Airport, the Right Honourable Lady is right to ask for some government position to be made clear on this, and there will be a written ministerial statement imminently. It may even come out whilst I'm still speaking, but I can't promise that, but it's certainly coming out today. And then there's fascination, Madam Deputy Speaker, there's sort of obsession with committee rooms in the Cabinet Office and which ones are being used for which particular purpose. There are many rooms, and it reminds me of the bit in the Gospel about there are many houses, but leaving that to one side, there are many rooms that are used, and my Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State, will be visiting Shrewsbury today, that the government is not just one person. It is a whole team of people. We are governed by cabinet government in this country, and the work is being done by the people whose responsibility it is, and the government has done a great deal to protect over 200,000 properties from flooding, and that is a very important safeguard because the people who are affected by floods, it is a terrible experience for them, and therefore to have protected 200,000 homes is an achievement. £4 billion is going to be spent on this. The Environment Agency has, I believe, on its bank account £2.7 billion of taxpayers' funds to disperse. So work is going on, work is continuing, and things are being done to help people affected, including £5,000 per household to put in flood defences and £500 to help people immediately. With regard to the Marmot report, the Prime Minister spoke about that yesterday at Prime Minister's Questions and said himself that the discrepancy in life expectancy in this country is a disgrace. It is an effort of this government to level up, and that includes levelling up life expectancy. But it is worth noting that the Marmot report also welcomes the record level of employment that we have achieved, because the best way out of poverty is always into employment, and that is something that the government is very committed to and has an incredibly good track record on. As for zero-hours contracts, they are a small portion of the total employment in this country. They provide a flexibility that is welcome to many employees and to employers, and that most of the new jobs created since 2010 have been full-time jobs. I think that's important to bear in mind. The Right Honourable Lady knows that I share her concern about Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, and it is a particular concern that the coronavirus has been rumoured, but I emphasise rumoured and not confirmed, to be in the prison in Evin, where Mrs Zaghari-Ratcliffe is. The UK ambassador to Iran has raised this with the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we are in contact with our international partners on this issue. The Iranian authorities have denied this at the moment, but I must confess I, for one, would not always take as authoritative denials issued by the Iranian government. So I thank the Right Honourable Lady for raising this again. The government is trying to do what it can in this very serious issue. With regard to the question of the House of Commons preparedness and provision of gel to ensure that people who are meeting the public have gel to clean their hands and so on, that's a matter of the House of Commons Commission and what both the Right Honourable Lady and I serve. So at our next meeting, I think Monday week, we will no doubt have a report as to quite what the state of affairs is.
Sir John Hayes.
Madam Deputy Speaker, given my right honourable friend's encyclopaedic and diligent understanding of the particular concerns of members, he will know that I am patron of the British nuclear test veterans. They are the young men and women that were sent into the South Pacific in the 1950s to witness the first nuclear test, Madam Deputy Speaker, at great risk to them and with severe consequences subsequently. When the members of South Staffordshire was Secretary of State for Defence, I took a delegation to see him and agreed to look at a medal for those people. Could we have a statement for the House on whether such a medal will be issued? Surely it's time to be generous to those who gave so much.
Madam Deputy Speaker, of course we should be generous to those who have served the country. Medals do not fall within my immediate area of responsibility, but I think it is something to raise directly with the Secretary of State, and I will do that on behalf of my right honourable friend.
Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This schedule that the Leader has presented today takes us to a point which is precisely 3 months since the date of the general election, and I have to say that I still find the pace of the agenda he puts before us rather sedate, and I am left wondering when this government is going to get into gear, or whether or not its proposals for the pace of the agenda he puts before us rather sedate, and I am left wondering when this government is going to get into gear, or whether or not its proposals for radical reform are not nearly as expansive as its Public Relations Department would have us believe. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the week in which both the Scottish and the United Kingdom governments are hosting major events on the drugs crisis which afflicts every part of this union. And there is a growing awareness in this chamber that the law needs to change in order to allow more effective interventions to save lives. So can I ask the Leader of the House, will the government bring forward a debate on the drugs crisis in the United Kingdom in order to look at changes in both secondary and primary legislation? Secondly, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to talk about the evil procedures and the estimates. The Leader may remember that when evil was introduced, and this party made the argument that many of the matters which are reserved to England and Wales have consequences through the Barnett formula for the funding of services in Scotland. Yeah. We were told at that time that since Barnett was essentially about money rather than policy, the proper place to debate this would be when the House comes to consider the estimates. Now, we have a bizarre situation coming up next week, where this House is being asked to approve hundreds of billions of pounds of public expenditure without any debate at all. I know that that is because the liaison committee has not met, but that is hardly our responsibility. And therefore I want to ask the Leader, will the government make arrangements to allow this House to debate the estimates and for us to move amendments about the consequences that they would have for public services in Scotland? And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to gently say to the Leader of the House that the fact that he will not answer my question does not make it go away. So I ask him again, when is the government going to bring forward proposals to deal with the fact that it does not have a mandate north of the Scottish border? And I say this in a week when another opinion poll has been published, this time asking people whether they wish to have a referendum on the question. And 55% of the Scottish public now want a referendum within the lifetime of this Parliament. Yeah. So when will the government stop ignoring that and deal with it?
Madam Deputy Speaker, dealing with the last point first, the honourable gentleman makes a very typical confusion. That is to say, when an answer is given that is not the answer that is wanted, that does not mean that the question has not been answered. These are two separate concepts, so I refer the honourable gentleman to the answer I have given previously from the dispatch box. As regards the speed with which this government has got off the starting blocks, we are the Lamborghini of governments, the Ferrari of governments. I have never known 0 to 60 being achieved at a faster pace. Bear in mind, within a few weeks of the general election, we're the Aston Martin of governments, if you prefer. I'm quite tempted to say the Bentley of governments, but my 1936 Bentley takes so long to get to 60 miles an hour that it wouldn't necessarily be the right comparison. After all, we have legislated to leave the European Union, which is perhaps the most fundamental piece of legislation that we could have passed. I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for raising the important issue of the drugs conference that is going on in Scotland today, and we are concerned at the rate of drug death in Scotland, which are 3 times higher than the UK average. So it is quite right that the conference is taking place in Scotland, and there needs to be a balanced policy involving enforcement, and some dozens of people were arrested yesterday alone in a number of raids in the county lines problem, and that it needs to be a mix of enforcement and of treatment, and I think working out precisely where policy should go is the right thing, and I'm sure that once that's done there will be statements and debates in this place. As regards estimates and evil, I have sympathy for what the honourable gentleman is saying. There are deadlines in terms of when the estimates have to be approved by, but the government is conscious that it owes the liaison committee and the backbench committee time to consider these issues, and that will be an opportunity for the honourable gentleman and his party to debate the matters that they wish to bring forward.
Order. I intend to run this till about 12:15. I will try to get everybody in, but that does depend on questions being very short and obviously appropriately the answers as well. Steve Double.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Government has rightly committed to net zero by 2050, and this includes phasing out petrol and diesel cars by 2035. But this is going to mean a huge increase in the demand of critical minerals such as lithium. Now, the Leader of the House may be aware that Cornwall is rich in lithium and many other minerals used for this industry. So can we have a statement from the Government on their strategy on securing a supply of these critical minerals for our motor industry and, where possible, a domestic supply?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Cornwall is rich in many things, not least is it rich in its brilliant Members of Parliament. And our approach on this matter to ensuring UK industrial consumers have continued access to the critical technology metals they need is firmly based on a global level, free, fair and open international trade. This has served the UK well, and we have not received any signals from companies or the markets that our policy should change, and we will monitor the situation closely and continue to engage with UK industry on this genuinely important matter.
Ian Mearns.
Very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, the Shadow Leader, for raising the issue of the Marmot report, because I think we've all been concerned on this side of the House about public health and the disparity in public health since the Black report and the Townsend report, and the Marmot report really follows up on that. And it seems now that for the first time in decades that health inequalities are actually getting worse in this country. So can we have a debate in government time, a full debate in government time, about what we can do to tackle the real and worsening health inequalities in our country at the moment? And can I also back up my right honourable friend's issue with sanitising hand gel? This House welcomes thousands of people every day from all over this country and beyond. And I would hate to see that this House would be a method for spreading a serious virus around the country. The House of Commons Commission might be meeting in 10 days' time, but that lacks urgency to me. Sanitising hand gel should be available because people touch doors, touch door handles. That's how the virus is being transmitted, and it will happen much in this House if we don't get that right very quickly.
Leader of the House.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There is a debate next week on health inequalities brought forward in the name of the Leader of the Opposition, and but that's the point of Opposition Day, so that the Opposition can debate the issues that members of the Opposition wish to debate. That's why they exist. So I believe that request is being met. As regards responsibilities of the House authorities, they are being done thoroughly, and hand gel is available, particularly for the security staff. It's worth reiterating what the Government's advice is. The Government's advice is regular hand washing and to use a Kleenex if you cough or blow your nose.
Is it Joe Gideon?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As my right honourable friend knows, for those furthest from the job market, good employment means good training and upskilling. Will he join me in congratulating North Staffordshire Engineering Group Association I visited recently for their excellent academy, which places 98% of the people that they train from the most disadvantaged backgrounds into local engineering companies?
Leader of the House.
Madam Deputy Speaker, may I congratulate my honourable friend, the work she has been doing on this, and absolutely congratulate the North Staffordshire Engineering Group. It is so important to help people get the skills they need and is a main focus of government policy and has long been championed by my right honourable friend, the member for Harlow.
Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Over the last few days, Delhi has been burning at the hands of Hindu extremism. 24 people have been deemed dead so far. Hundreds have been injured under this extreme violence. The Indian government has enacted this citizen law, which has also produced camps, concentration camps, where they'll be placed and housed people who lived in India for years. There are communal violence against Muslims, day in, day out, summary beatings, torture and deaths taking on the streets, as well as the oppression of the Kashmiri people. Can the Speaker, can the Leader of the House please find some time either to get the government to make an urgent, to make a statement and have a debate in government's time to have a serious discussion about the human rights and civil liberties at the behest of the Indian government?
Leader of the House.
Madam Speaker, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to raise this pressing matter. We are deeply concerned at the severity and scale of violations of freedom of religious belief in many parts of the world. In December, the Foreign Secretary announced an independent review into Foreign and Commonwealth Office support for persecuted Christians overseas, and there was debate on the persecution of Christians on the 6th of February. But this does not mean that we are not concerned about the persecution of other religions across the world. I would urge the honourable gentleman to raise this matter in next month's Foreign Office questions, but the seriousness of what he is mentioning in the House today has not passed the government by.
It's William Cash.
May I congratulate the government on the statement that's been made with regard to the future relationship with the EU, and would the Leader of the House note that the European Scrutiny Committee will be fully engaged in this. It's being set up now, and that the questions of sovereignty and the question of vital national interests of the United Kingdom are matters within our remit, and we will be giving that absolute and total attention in the future. Finally, could I just ask the question about the procedural motion on the high-speed rail? What is this for? Is it not just simply to provide for a carryover motion, and should not Phase 2A be rolled into Phase 2B?
Question. Leader of the House.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we're back to the to be or not to be, which seems to be my honourable friend's question. It is a procedural motion of a standard and routine kind, which we need for the progression of business. I'm delighted to hear that the European Scrutiny Committee will be bringing its eagle eye to look at the questions of sovereignty. He chairs that committee with such brilliance, and when I served on it for some years, it was one of the best committees possible to be on, and the diligence he applies to this is a model for us all.
Chris Stevens.
Madam Deputy Speaker, according to NSPCC estimates, there are up to 90 reports a day of online harms. That's one every 16 minutes. Given that 13 voluntary codes of social media regulation appear to have failed, can we have a statement of debate on online harms regulations so we can get commitments from ministers about Ofcom's proposed enforcement powers?
To the House.
The Online Harms White Paper sets out our plans for world-leading legislation to make the UK the safest place in the world to be online, and ahead of this legislation the Government will publish interim codes of practice on tackling the use of the Internet by terrorists and those engaged in child sexual abuse and exploitation. This will ensure that companies take action now to tackle content that threatens our national security and the physical safety of children, and these matters are obviously ones that will be discussed in this House.
Tom Hunt.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wanted to know whether the Leader of the House would set aside time so this House can debate the College of Policing's hate crime operational guidance to remove the requirement that police forces have to record non-crime hate incidents. I do believe the current system is open to abuse by politically motivated individuals who seek to smear people they disagree with. And earlier this morning I was with Harry Miller discussing this very case.
I had the pleasure of meeting Mr Harry Miller last night at an event in support of free speech, and free speech is fundamental to this nation. And of course the government has heard the very powerful judgment of the High Court in his case. And the Home Secretary made extremely clear yesterday that she will hold the police in this country to account for reducing crime, because that is the job of our wonderful police.
Judith Cummins.
Mr Speaker. During National Apprenticeship Week, I visited a number of excellent local businesses in my constituency and met with apprentices who told me about the opportunities that their apprenticeship provides. But there are concerns from many, including now the Education Secretary, that the levy is not working as it should, with too much focus on already highly skilled workers and not on those with no or low skills. So can we have a debate in government time on much-needed reforms to the apprenticeship levy?
Leader of the House.
I seem to remember that the apprenticeship levy came out of a budget, and we will be having the budget debate fairly shortly, and I think that would be a very suitable time to raise these important issues.
Bone.
Madam Deputy Speaker, could we have a statement next week, preferably on Wednesday, on celebrating United Nations Public Sector Appreciation Day, so we can show our support to the police, the NHS and everyone who works in the public service? And could the government tell us how they're going to celebrate that day? And why not have a bank holiday closest to that date?
Leader of the House.
My honourable friend's desire for bank holidays means that none of us would ever be working, and as a general rule the government tries to avoid too many statements on opposition days as a courtesy to the opposition, so the day my honourable friend is suggesting may not be ideal, but may I pay tribute to our hard-working civil servants, particularly those in the Lord President of the Council's office.
And Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. If we're not to have an oral statement on the Heathrow judgment, and given the government has decided not to appeal it, will the Leader of the House take this opportunity to confirm the government does not intend to keep the disastrous third runway scheme alive?
House.
It would be wrong of me to preempt the written ministerial statement which will be laid before this House today. In terms of an oral statement, there were already 4 oral statements today, an important debate on St David's Day to follow, and we have to be courteous towards the House, and it is unusual to have an oral statement announced after the start of business, though not unprecedented.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The port of Grimsby, part of which falls in my Cleethorpes constituency, is the country's major centre for service and maintenance in the offshore energy industry. In view of the government's desire to move civil servants out of London, could I urge my right honourable friend to ask the Business and Energy Department if they will look at relocating perhaps the policy team and some officials that deal with regulating the offshore sector to the Grimsby Cleethorpes area? Could he arrange for a statement?
Deputy Speaker, by the time the honourable gentleman has finished with his demands for rail, his demands for road and his demands for ports, Cleethorpes is going to be the new metropolis of the world, and I think everybody will be moving there, and how fortunate the good people of Cleethorpes are to have my honourable friend as their representative.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My Scottish constituents are approaching her 16th birthday, but as her parents had French nationality when she was born, despite the fact her mum's now got UK citizenship, she's going to have to pay £1,000 to get her UK citizenship. It's unaffordable at her age. It's also fees are a rip-off, given the Home Office uses this income to pay for other funds. So can we have a debate in government time about fair fees and what can be done to help my constituent get UK citizenship so that she can access college?
House.
May I once again congratulate the honourable gentleman on the way he brings forward his constituents' cases in the chamber. I think everyone will have sympathy with the case that he raises, and I will be more than happy to take that up with the Home Office on his behalf. Fees ought to be fair and reasonable and proportionate, and I hope the House will remember that the application for settled status for European nationals is free.
Lord Trott.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the vote to set up the steering group to deal with complaints and grievances in Parliament. Will the Leader update the House on the latest developments on implementing Cox 3?
I'm grateful to the honourable lady for raising that point, because it is open for consultation at the moment, and this may be of interest to many members. The Cox 3 recommendation was how do we deal with complaints of bullying and harassment against members of Parliament in an independent fashion. And the proposal that is being consulted on is that this should be done by a wholly independent panel, but that if a sanction of suspension or expulsion from the House were to be recommended, that would have to be voted upon by the House. And I would strongly encourage all honourable and right honourable members to make their views known whilst the consultation is live, rather than coming to raise questions with me after it has happened, which is one of the risks of public life.
John Cryer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following on from my right honourable friend's question, could we have a statement on the vetting processes for officials? I hear what the leader says about security issues. However, the notion that we've had a man working in the heart of government who believes in eugenics and racial supremacy is deeply alarming and, I hope, unprecedented. So could we have a statement?
Thank you. I refer the honourable gentleman to what I said earlier about vetting, but I would say that my own view about eugenics, and this is, as far as I'm aware, the Prime Minister's view too, as he stated yesterday, is that it is the most dreadful belief, and it is, to my mind, fundamentally ungodly.
Bob Blackman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, on the 19th of April we will commemorate the 101st anniversary of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in the Punjab in India. Last year I led a debate in Westminster Hall as we approached the centenary and asked the government to apologise. So could we now have a debate in government time and the opportunity for the government to apologise on behalf of the British people for the massacre in India?
Madam Deputy Speaker, from memory, Winston Churchill was himself very clear at the time about the appallingness of what happened 101 years ago. I think the debate was held last year, and the 100th anniversary was the right time to do it. But I would urge my honourable friend to raise this matter in Foreign Office questions next month.
Zara Sultana.
Last week, I met with a Coventry business who are owed a significant amount of money from contractors that have poor payment practices or who have gone into administration. This company may now be forced to lay off workers. Will the Leader of the House grant parliamentary time in government time to discuss how contractors drive local companies out of business based not on their performance, but because their payments have been withheld?
There's an important issue that's often raised in this House. I would urge the Honourable Lady to seek an adjournment debate on the specific issues affecting contractors in her constituency. But the Government does have codes of conduct, and as the Government itself tries to ensure that it pays contractors promptly.
James Sunderland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given the current focus on the imminent strategic defence and security review, will the Leader of the House agree to a much-needed debate on defence?
I'm very grateful for the honourable gentleman for that question. The Backbench Business Committee, when it was set up, was given 4 or possibly 5 days in its total allocation, which were meant to be for defence. So this is something that should be raised with the Backbench Business Committee in about a week's time.
Martin Dowd.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm currently waiting for a response to a public petition which I submitted on behalf of the Falkirk Forgotten Villages campaign relating to high energy costs as much as £150 per week. And I'm wondering if the Leader of the House could help assist move this issue forward by perhaps securing a debate in government time to look at the issue of fuel poverty and energy price caps.
Leader of the House.
Madam Deputy Speaker, if any honourable member has not received a response from a government department in a reasonable amount of time, I'm more than happy to facilitate that, but I think the debate is probably one for the Backbench Business Committee.
Philip Hollowbone.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I bring good news from Kettering, where last night Kettering Borough Council, of which I have the privilege to be a member, in the teeth of opposition from independent Lib Dem and Labour councillors, voted for the 10th year in a row to freeze its share of the council tax. And it's done this at the same time as maintaining frontline public services, as well as maintaining financial support for the voluntary sector. Will my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, seek information from the Department for Local Government as to whether any other district or borough council has managed such a fine record, and will he take this opportunity to congratulate the inspirational leader of Kettering Borough Council, Councillor Russell Roberts, on this fine achievement?
I think a statue should be erected to Councillor Russell Roberts for this achievement, and it would come out of public subscription, and I would be more than happy to make a modest contribution.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Oh, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can we have a debate, please, about the role of private sector train companies that run train stations, manage train stations, and provide substandard facilities for passengers? In Hull, TransPennine Express built new toilets and a waiting room in 2018. By April, they were seen to be botched. The toilets smell of urine and the waiting room is not suitable. I was told in December 2018 that they would be fixed by 2019. We're now at the end of February 2020 and no action.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady, as always, raises an important point in relation to her constituents. She has raised it publicly, and I hope the operating company is duly shamed by the smell that is coming from the toilets in Hull. It really seems that when money is being spent, it should be spent properly, and people are held to account for the way they spend money.
John Stevenson.
Thank you. I'd like to follow the theme of my honourable friend. In Carlisle, we have a part of DEFRA, namely the Rural Payment Agency. Would the Leader of the House arrange for a statement on the likelihood of further relocation of the activities of that department, and would you support such a move to Carlisle?
Leader of the House.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is tempting me beyond my brief, and you never know, I might start advocating all these agencies move to North East Somerset rather than to my honourable friend's constituencies. But his point has been heard and made, and I will ensure that it's passed on to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs.
Sam Tarrant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just bringing the House's attention, and particularly the Leader of the House attention, to my EDM 220 on the harassment of trade unionists at London City Airport. I wonder if the Leader of the House might make some time to actually discuss in a debate or put forward a government statement about exactly what has gone on at London City Airport, because surely a government that claims to be on the side of the workers will want to make some space so we can actually hear that this sort of thing is not going to be continued or be allowed to continue, because one of my constituents has been sacked from their job specifically for trade union activities.
Madam Deputy Speaker, everybody should feel content in their place of work, and that's why in the House of Commons we've set up the ICGS to deal with complaints here, and we would urge other employers to have similar methods in place. As regards the debate, I tend to think these very specific issues are very well handled with adjournment debates, that they bring them to the right level of attention.
Margaret Ferrier.
Deputy Speaker, my constituent was employed by a recruitment agency and had to leave a job for health reasons. Despite promising to put her on garden leave to help her recuperate and pay her for her 2-week notice period, my constituent still hasn't received the money she is due for the work carried out. Can we have a debate in government time on exploitation of workers in the gig economy?
Leader of the House.
Madam Deputy Speaker, people who are contractually owed money must be paid it, and the Honourable Lady is right to raise this here. I think a debate on the issues is not necessarily the right way to go about it, but raising this case is, and I hope the company will be shamed into making payments, and I feel great sympathy for the Honourable Lady's constituent who ought to be paid if she's done the work.
Bill Esterson.
The 9th of January, the Leader of the House advised me to ask the Secretary of State for Education for a meeting about Lydiate Primary School. He advised me to come back to him if such a meeting wasn't forthcoming. It's 7 weeks later. The meeting has not been offered by ministers. Would the Leader of the House please intervene on not on my behalf, but on behalf of the children and staff at Lydiate Primary School? It is unsafe and unsuitable for education.
Leader of the House.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my hard-working civil servants have heard what the honourable gentleman has said, and I will make sure that this is followed up with the department immediately after this session.
Owen Thompson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, recently Bank of Scotland announced a series of branch closures around Scotland, including Lonehead in my constituency. Midlothian is often referred to as one of the fastest-growing communities in Scotland. The community is left without a branch now, as that was the final branch, and despite meeting with Bank of Scotland immediately after the announcement, I've had no further answers to the questions I raised. Would the Leader of the House make time available in government time for a debate on what we can do to consider the impacts on a community when the final branch in a community is closed?
Leader of the House.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an issue that comes up regularly at these sessions, and I have arranged meetings with the relevant minister. It is important to recognise that these are commercial decisions, and the government can't intervene in them individually, and banks must balance customer interests, market competition and other commercial interests when taking their decisions. But since May 2017, high street banks have signed up to the Access for Banking Standards, which does commit them to working with customers and communities to minimise the impact of branch closures. If that is not happening, then the government will have to look at that very carefully.
Chris Elmore.
In June of last year, the Home Office consultation ended on violence and tackling that violence towards shop workers. Now, I know the Leader of the House would agree with me there's never any excuse for abuse towards shop workers and would welcome the trade unions work as store that they're doing to protect shop workers. So could I ask him to ask Home Office ministers to come to the floor of the House to make a statement so we can start tackling these abuses?
The House.
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right. There is no excuse for abusing people working in shops. It is quite improper behaviour. I can't promise a statement, but I will raise this with the Home Office to see what the response is to the report.
Kate Green.
Like my right honourable friend, the Shadow Leader, I too was pleased to notice the motions for the constitution of most select committees, but that did not include motions in relation to the Committee on Standards and Privileges, both of which have a long legacy of work left over from the previous Parliament. Can the Leader advise me when he expects those motions to be tabled?
Leader of the House.
The honourable lady is right to emphasise the importance of those committees, and motions will be brought forward as soon as is reasonably practicable.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With further international discussions taking place in May in New York, will the Leader of the House make a statement explaining the UK Government's hostility to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? And does he not appreciate that this hostility towards prohibition is inconsistent with the UK's strategic objectives and its obligations under Article 6 of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty to make good faith attempts to move towards the eventual abolition of nuclear weapons programmes?
Madam Speaker, I think we have to be realistic and recognise the world is the world that we live in, and that nuclear weapons are around, and it is in the UK's national interest to maintain our nuclear deterrent.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was confused by the Leader of the House's answer to the honourable gentleman who's not in his seat anymore about the Security and Defence Review. The Prime Minister put out a written statement yesterday, but he then intimated there would be an oral statement or a debate, not one in backbench business time. So can you tell us when that will take place? And will the Intelligence and Security Committee have been reformed by then so we can consider the Russia report as part of that?
Leader of the House.
As the Prime Minister has said, don't get too excited about the Russian report. That whilst it's not released, I think the conspiracy theorists are having a whale of a time. When it comes out, I think they will be sadly disappointed. The point I was making is that the Backbench Business Committee was given responsibility, as its brief when it was set up, for defence debates. Of course, if the government brings forward specific statements, they will have questions following the statement.
Justin Madders.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On Tuesday, the mayors of Salford, Manchester and London came together outside Parliament to hear from victims of the cladding scandal. They heard terrible stories from leaseholders about them being trapped in properties, of the financial ruin they're facing and the mental torment of going to sleep every night in a flat that they know may be a potential death trap. There is clearly a need for some debating time on the floor of the House for the clarity and leadership needed from government. I see the Secretary of State is sat next to the Leader of the House. Can he guarantee that we will get that time as a matter of urgency?
Leader of the House.
Well, the honourable gentleman's question is very well timed with my right honourable friend sitting next to me, because I can assure the House that my right honourable friend takes this matter with the utmost seriousness. £600 million of taxpayers' money is being committed to removing dangerous cladding, but the government, and particularly my right honourable friend, is ensuring that the dangerous cladding is removed and that houses and flats are made safe for people. And if I may say, whilst he is sitting here, the number of times my right honourable friend has raised this with other ministers and is pushing for it as hard as possible is one that can give the honourable gentleman confidence.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board have announced a temporary suspension of evening, weekend GP out-of-hours services in the Vale of Leven Hospital in my constituency, with UK changes to pensions and how GPs are affected being a reason. The BMA and RCGP have highlighted the drastic problems posed to the NHS workforce by current pension tax policy. And does the Leader of the House agree with me it's now time before the budget for a statement on what action the Government is taking to tackle this issue, which has far-ranging consequences for the whole of the UK?
Leader of the House.
The honourable gentleman very cleverly answers his own question when he says before the budget. These are matters for the budget. I think there is a lot of sympathy with what the honourable gentleman is saying.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In India, the attacks by Hindus on Christians and Muslims have increased, and there is evidence that the police are turning a blind eye to the attacks. Hundreds have been killed, thousands have been injured, and chaos reigns, and all because of the new citizenship law that disenfranchises Christians and Muslims. Would the Leader of the House agree to a debate on this urgent and very disturbing matter?
Leader of the House.
The honourable gentleman may well have heard my earlier answer on a similar question, and I don't want to repeat all of that, other than to reiterate the point that the government takes this extremely seriously, and I would urge the honourable gentleman to raise this at next month's Foreign Office questions, but it is a very serious matter.
Thank you. We now come to statement from Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, Robert Jenrick.
Well, with permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to update the House on the latest rough sleeping annual statistics for 2019 published today and the new approach of the government. I think we can all agree, Madam Deputy Speaker, that it is a moral shame that we see so many people sleeping rough on our streets. We are determined to end the blight of rough sleeping, and we've placed this great social ill at the heart of the moral mission of this government. Today's figures are encouraging. They show that for a second year in a row, the number of people sleeping rough has fallen. Across England, the numbers have fallen by 9%, building on last year's reduction, which was the first fall in 8 years. Areas funded by the government's rough sleeping initiative saw a 12% decrease. Manchester is down by 26%, Camden down by 54%, Birmingham down by 43%, and Enfield down 69%. Cornwall is down by 55%, Hastings down 56%, the City of London is down 39%, Swale down 69%, Bedford down 41%, Tameside is down by 86%. London saw a decrease of 11%. This is the first decrease in the number of rough sleepers in London for 6 years, and the largest decrease since 2010. And that, as those colleagues who represent London constituencies will know, comes despite the very considerable and specific challenges faced in the capital, including, as the figures show, the fact that 42% of those sleeping rough in the city are non-UK nationals, and quite possibly more than that. This confirms what I have seen since I became Housing Secretary in the summer, that dedicated, targeted support, backed by significant levels of government support, is getting vulnerable people off the streets and into the safe accommodation where they can begin to turn their lives around. The government strategy is working. I'd like to pay tribute to the hard work of charities, of service providers, of local authorities, and of many, many volunteers, backed by government funding across the country, who are working tirelessly to give rough sleepers the support they need to help them off the streets and to begin the long and complex process of turning their lives around. But this does not mean our work ends here. We are, perhaps, coming up out of the valley, but we are very far from the mountaintop. This Conservative government has made it an overriding priority to end rough sleeping by the end of this Parliament. There is a great deal more to do, and we must be honest with ourselves about the scale of the challenge and tackle it head-on with renewed vigour. That's why I'm pleased that the Prime Minister and I are today announcing that Dame Louise Casey will lead a review into rough sleeping. This work will consider the links between the 24-hour street activity and rough sleeping, particularly physical and mental health issues. It will provide advice to me and to the Prime Minister on how we can best use the levers of central and local government to support this group and to continue to reduce rough sleeping across the country. I know Dame Louise's vast experience, her rigour, her candour. The fact that she's worked across party for many years means that this is the right person to look at what is needed and help get the job done. I want to support Dame Louise to move at pace, a pace commensurate with the seriousness and the urgency of the action that we must take now. Meanwhile, we will continue to build on our successful rough sleeping strategy, guided by the best evidence, intervening rapidly where people are sleeping on the streets, and putting people's recovery to ensure that they never have to sleep rough again. Putting this ambition into practice, the Government has today announced £236 million of new money for move-on accommodation, safely supporting up to an additional 6,000 rough sleepers and those at immediate risk of rough sleeping off the streets into the safe and secure accommodation they deserve, with the support wrapped around them. This is on top of the £437 million the Government has provided to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping in the next financial year, including more than £112 million to fund services through the Rough Sleeping Initiative. This funding will be used by councils to provide up to 6,000 beds and 2,500 support staff over the next year. So the numbers will be increasing very rapidly in terms of beds. We recognise that there are particular challenges about responding to the increase in EEA national rough sleepers, and honourable members may recall that as part of the Cold Weather Fund, the Government took the unprecedented decision to extend limited powers to the most affected local authorities to support certain EEA nationals sleeping rough for a limited period of time. This approach has been successful, with over 400 EEA nationals accommodated in November and December last year, and many of them supported into work or to return home. So the Government has today taken the decision to continue some of these services until the 31st of December 2020, when the transition period ends and the new immigration system will be in place. And I will be working closely with the Home Secretary on how we address these challenges at the end of the transition period. Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst prevention, outreach and emergency support are of course vital, we need secure, sustainable accommodation to end rough sleeping for good, and increasing the provision of affordable housing is fundamental to making that happen. This Government has delivered nearly 500,000 new affordable homes. We've also abolished the council borrowing cap so that local authorities are able to build up to 10,000 more social homes a year, and many are doing it. We cannot and will not let that momentum slip. That's why we've already committed to 250,000 new affordable homes by March 2022 through the Affordable Homes Programme, backed by £9 billion. We're increasing the supply of social housing, and we will ensure that rough sleepers and those at risk of rough sleeping are provided with homes that are available long-term and appropriate to their needs. We simply must build more homes as a country, and I will be doing all I can to ensure that. But boosting housing supply is just one of many long-term measures that we must take to properly and permanently address homelessness and rough sleeping. We have to redouble our efforts to tackle the underlying problems that have led many people to fall into a life on the streets. Last year, 4 in 10 of the rough sleeping population in London were suffering from a severe drug dependency, and the same proportion were suffering from alcohol dependency. Half of all rough sleepers were assessed as having a mental health support need. And shockingly, the data from 2017 indicates that 8 in 10 rough sleepers who have died in London suffered from severe mental health conditions. We can't allow this injustice to continue. We're stepping up our work to provide specialist help and support for those suffering from mental health, and this is backed now by £30 million of additional funding from NHS England. On top of this, we're working to implement test models of community-based provision across 6 projects that are designed to enable access to health and support services for people who are sleeping rough with both mental ill health and substance dependency needs. Rough sleeping is as much a health challenge as a housing one, and our work going forwards will reflect this. We also need a concerted effort to bring the different support services together, from outreach to housing, health, policing and immigration, so we can effectively tackle the multiple issues that lead individuals to find themselves homeless. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are acutely aware of the scale of the challenge before us. Ending rough sleeping within this Parliament is one of the most ambitious targets set by any government since the publication of the Beveridge Report and the creation of the welfare state. We accept this challenge as a moral mission and an obligation that we cannot pass up. Many of the underlying causes of rough sleeping I've spoken about today are deep-rooted, built up over successive generations, indeed successive governments. I hope members across the House will support us in this collective endeavour and help us as a country to achieve this simple but profoundly important objective: to bring rough sleeping to an end once and for all.
Shadow Minister Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. Madam Deputy Speaker, rough sleeping is not inevitable in a country as decent and well-off as ours. The cost of a decade of austerity has been over 700 deaths last year on our streets, and huge numbers of children and families in bed and breakfast and temporary accommodation. It is the defining mark of this Conservative government. Any improvement on that record is welcome, but today's figures show that the number of people sleeping rough in shop doorways and on park benches is more than double what it was when Labour left government. This shames us all, and it shames Conservative ministers most of all, and it must end. And today's figures come with a big health warning. Everyone, from the Secretary of State to homeless charities, knows that these statistics are an unreliable undercount of the true scale of the problem. The figures have been refused national statistics status, a mark of trustworthiness, quality and public value. Yesterday, Labour's Shadow Housing Secretary wrote to the UK Statistics Authority to ask them to investigate their accuracy. This follows new data obtained by the BBC under the Freedom of Information Act, showing that ministers have been dramatically underreporting the scale of rough sleeping. The BBC revealed 25,000 people sleeping rough in England, 5 times the number recorded by the government's own statistics. And even on today's unreliable figures, the government is set to break its own pledge to end rough sleeping by the end of Parliament. At the current rate of success of progress, they will not end rough sleeping until 2037. So whilst the Secretary of State's ambitious words are welcome, how does he intend to reach his target without further investment? The announcement today, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the government will go some way to following Labour's proposals and fund housing for rough sleepers following the Housing First model is welcome. But we remember that his party promised 200,000 starter homes and didn't build a single one. And when the Prime Minister was Mayor of London, he promised to end rough sleeping in the capital by 2012, but rough sleeping doubled. So we are right to be sceptical and ask the Secretary of State to clarify by what date will these homes be made available, how will the locations be determined, and is this funding genuinely extra, as he claims, or has it been diverted from other programmes in the department's budget? It's not just the government that has turned a blind eye to the homelessness crisis for so long, which they have. They've refused to face up to the fact that they have actively created the crisis. They have cut £1 billion per year from local homelessness reduction budgets, and there's no commitment today to reverse that. They have cut investment in new homes for social rent to record levels, no commitment to reverse that. And they have failed to deliver on their pledge to end unfair evictions, the leading cause of homelessness. Much like other symptoms of the housing crisis, like the spiralling housing benefit bill, the funding needed to tackle rough sleeping will continue to rise if we do not invest in addressing the root causes of the housing crisis. That means more than warm words about bringing health and housing together. It means facing up to the impact of deep cuts to welfare, mental health support and addiction services since 2010. But this government is in denial about the root causes of homelessness. Perhaps that's why the Housing Secretary chose to appoint someone as his PPS with specific responsibility for rough sleeping, who thinks that sleeping rough is a lifestyle choice, who claims that many people choose to be on the streets and that it's more comfortable than going on exercise in the army. That is particularly insulting, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the hundreds of our armed forces veterans who are sleeping rough, who this government has abandoned despite their years of service to our country. Madam Deputy Speaker, As the first snowfall of the new decade falls on our streets outside, we must face up to the human cost of this Conservative government. 2 people a day dying on our streets, 127,000 children homeless in temporary accommodation, rough sleeping figures 5 times higher than the official statistics. Homelessness was tackled by the last Labour government when we inherited a similar scale of crisis. We reduced rough sleeping by 3/4. The announcements today from the Secretary of State will not go far enough to deliver on his targets. And to quote Louise Casey, we have gone from a beacon of success to an international example of failure. We must not allow this issue to be ignored. We must feel its impact and act as the country we are proud to be.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I accept the honourable lady's comments and say with all sincerity and humility that we must do more as a country to tackle this, and that's exactly what this new Conservative administration intends to do. The Prime Minister and I have put this at the heart of our agenda, and we intend to deliver on the promises that we've made today. She asked me about the statistics, and I think she's misinformed about those. The statistics we published today are not the government statistics. These are statistics used in a rigorous count that's produced by local authorities with independent verification. They're then compiled independently by Homeless Link, which is the umbrella organisation of some of the most respected homeless charities in this country, including Shelter and Crisis and St Mungo. This is the same methodology that's been used for 10 years and is broadly the same as that used in most developed countries like Canada and Japan, and is highly respected. And it is vastly superior, I have to say, than the methodology under the last Labour government, at which point the shadow housing secretary was the housing minister in this country. That was a methodology which was deeply flawed, and we asked local authorities only to count if they thought, in their opinion, that there were more than 10 individuals who were sleeping rough, and as a result of that, there was no count in vast parts of the country. So the statistics today are robust and are a huge improvement on that which came before them. She asked about the rough sleeping initiative and some of the funding that we've put in. Actually, these are very significant increases. The RSI has gone up by 30% this year. We are spending on £400 million in the next financial year, and the announcement we've made today is an additional £236 million on top of that, and yes, it is new money. She asked about housing more generally. Well, I have to say that last year we built more homes in this country than any year in the last 30 years, that we are building on average more affordable homes in this country every year than the last Labour government built, and that more council houses were built in this country last year than in 13 years of the last Labour government. And where does Labour have control? In Wales. How many council houses were built in Wales last year? 57. How many the year before that? 80. How many the 3 years before that? 0, 0, 0. And what is the #1 challenge facing us as a government in meeting our housing targets in this country? Well, it's the failing Labour Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. She also asked about our commitment to create a fairer deal between the tenant and the landlord. Well, absolutely. In the Queen's speech, we said we would bring forward a renters' rights bill, which will be a very significant piece of legislation. We're in the process of creating that bill, and absolutely it will bring an end to Section 21. And finally, she made some disparaging remarks about my honourable friend, the member for Gravesham. I'd politely point out that he spent over 5 months in the last few years sleeping rough on the streets of London, of Birmingham, of New York City. I don't know, perhaps I'm mistaken, but I don't know if the honourable lady has done that. I don't know if any other member of this House has spent so much time with members of our homeless population. I know for a fact he has members of staff in his office in this House who he has mentored off the streets and into a better life. And he does sometimes ask unacceptable questions, as George Orwell would say, but you have to ask unacceptable questions sometimes if we as politicians genuinely want to tackle the big questions of our age. And if we want to tackle rough sleeping, we have to tackle addiction as well.
Tim Lawton.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I commend the commitment of my right honourable friend to this issue and the additional investment by the government, which is starting to bear fruit, but there's still much to say. And can I particularly welcome his recognition that it's not just about sustainable income, it's about dealing with the underlying problems of those who find themselves on the street. And to that end, can I invite him to come to Worthing, where a really innovatory scheme, a partnership between Turning Tides, a homelessness charity, Worthing Borough Council and a developer, Roffey Homes, who's made available a nurses' home, which will be developed after 5 years, and where rough sleepers are now not just given accommodation, but they're given support from mental health services, from the Benefits Office and the NHS, and sustainable living. And because of that, the last count of overnight rough sleepers, having been previously in the 30s, was down to 7. That's the sort of innovation and partnership we want, and I very much hope he'll come and see it and make sure it's spread throughout the rest of the country as well.
Secretary of State.
Well, I'd be delighted to visit my honourable friend's constituency, and at the heart of the new strategy we're going to bring forward is bringing together a coordinated approach both within central government, so Dame Louise Casey and I will be working to ensure that the Department for Health, the Department for Work and Pensions, the Home Office, we're all working as a team to deliver this, and we see that already working in local communities, and some brilliant charities, St Mungo's for example, that uses mobile hubs to go to a specific hotspot for rough sleeping, bring all the services together, and that's the surest way to tackle this challenge.
Martin Day.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Minister for advance sight of his statement, and I would agree with him that it is a moral scandal that we have rough sleeping in this day and age, and I wish him every success with his strategy to tackle rough sleeping by the end of this Parliament. I have a few points I would make. Over the last 4 years to 2019, the Scottish Government delivered 5 times more social rented properties per head of population than the Westminster Government has. And progress out of poverty is more likely in Scotland as a result, and poverty rates are lower in Scotland due to affordable housing. Earlier this month, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation reported that for someone with the same life circumstances, such as qualifications, wage and family type, progress out of poverty is more likely if they live in Scotland or Northern Ireland than the rest of the UK. And the GRF's report also attributes lower poverty rates in Scotland compared to England and Wales to lower rents in the social housing sector, as well as Scotland having a higher proportion of social rented property. So I have a couple of questions on that. Will the Government's review of its homelessness strategy look at what has been done in other countries such as Scotland, and will they follow the Scottish Government's lead on building genuinely affordable housing?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for those comments, and will happily certainly look at the experience in Scotland and other parts of the Union, as indeed internationally. And one of the purposes of bringing in someone as respected as Dame Louise Casey, who now has not just a great deal of experience within the UK, but is also an internationally respected figure, is to learn from other parts of the world. I believe we're already doing that. Our Housing First pilots, for example, is very much learning on what's happened in Finland and the United States, where we've seen tremendous progress, in some cases success rates of up to 90%, where individuals have the simple premise of getting into accommodation first, but having very sophisticated long-term wraparound support around them. So we're keen to learn from best practice all over the world.
Angela Richardson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can my right honourable friend confirm whether the independent review by Dame Louise Casey will engage with the many excellent charities across the country you've mentioned, such as St Mungo's and Crisis, as well as Guildford Action in my constituency, which is a local centre of excellence?